When Sheriff Mercer dumped his paralyzed daughter on Eli Decker's doorstep like a sack of grain, he thought he was playing the cruelest joke imaginable. What he didn't know was that he'd just set in motion a love story that would transform two broken souls into an unbreakable force. This is the tale of Clara and Eli, a story of redemption, defiance, and the kind of love that blooms in the harshest soil. Stay with me until the very end, because this journey will take you through heartbreak and triumph like you've never experienced. And please let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the weathered planks of Eli Decker's front porch, casting long shadows across the dusty yard where tumbleweeds gathered like forgotten dreams. The year was 1887, and the frontier was still wild enough to swallow a man's hopes whole, yet civilized enough to break his spirit with bureaucracy and small-town cruelty. Eli stood in his doorway, coffee growing cold in one of his calloused hands, watching the dust cloud approach from the east. He'd lived on this land for 8 years now, ever since he'd returned from the war with a limp in his left leg and ghosts in his eyes that no amount of whiskey could chase away. The ranch wasn't much a modest house he'd built, with his own hands, a barn that leaned slightly to the south, and enough grazing land to support a small herd of cattle that somehow managed to survive despite his often distracted care. Most folks in Copper Ridge gave Eli a wide berth. They knew about Sarah, and little Annie knew about the fire that had taken them both while he was away selling cattle in Phoenix. They knew about the nights he'd spent in the saloon afterward, picking fights with men twice his size, begging God or the devil or anyone who'd listen to take him too. But time has a way of dulling even the sharpest grief, and eventually Eli had stopped drinking, stopped fighting, and started the long, slow process of learning how to live with the hollow space in his chest where his family used to be. The dust cloud drew closer, and Eli could make out the familiar shape of Sheriff Mercer's wagon. Behind Mercer rode 2 of his deputies, their faces grim beneath the brims of their hats. Eli set down his coffee cup and stepped out onto the porch, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the Colt 45 at his hip. In his experience, the law only came calling when someone was in trouble, and he couldn't think of anything he'd done lately to warrant a visit. Sheriff Marcus Mercer was a large man, both in stature and reputation. He'd held the position for nearly 15 years, ruling Copper Ridge and the surrounding territory with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove of false civility. His thick mustache was perfectly waxed, his uniform immaculate despite the dust of the trail, and his pale blue eyes held the kind of cold calculation that made even honest men nervous. The wagon came to a stop in front of Eli's porch, and Mercer climbed down with the deliberate movements of a man who wanted everyone to notice his authority. His deputies remained mounted, their hands resting casually near their weapons, a not-so-subtle reminder of the power dynamic at play. "Afternoon, Decker," Mercer called out, tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Eli said nothing, his gray eyes fixed on the sheriff's face. He'd learned long ago that silence was often more powerful than words, especially when dealing with men like Mercer who loved the sound of their own voices. The sheriff's smile faltered slightly at Eli's lack of response, but he pressed on. "I've come to discuss a matter of some importance with you, a business proposition, you might say." "Don't recall asking for any business with you, Sheriff," Eli replied, his voice rough from disuse. He rarely spoke to anyone these days, and the words felt foreign on his tongue. Mercer laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the empty yard. "Oh, but you see, this isn't the kind of business a man gets to refuse. This is the kind that falls under civic duty, community service, that sort of thing." He gestured toward the wagon, and for the first time Eli noticed there was something or someone in the back covered by a worn canvas tarp. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the tarp was moving slightly, as if there was a person underneath struggling to breathe in the stifling heat. "You see, Decker, I've got myself a problem." Mercer continued, circling the wagon like a vulture. A burden, you might say. Something that's been weighing me down for far too long. He grabbed the edge of the tarp and yanked it away with a dramatic flourish, revealing a young woman lying in the wagon bed. She was perhaps 20 years old, with long auburn hair that had come loose from its braid and now lay in tangled waves around her shoulders. Her dress was simple but clean, the kind a respectable woman might wear to church, though it was now wrinkled and dusty from the journey. But it was her eyes that caught Eli's attention, large green eyes that blazed with a fierce intelligence and barely contained fury. She was looking directly at him, and in that gaze he saw something he recognized, the look of someone who had been broken by the world, but refused to let it show. "Allow me to introduce my daughter Clara," Mercer said with theatrical grandness. Though I suppose daughter is a generous term at this point, more accurate to call her damaged goods. Clara's face flushed with humiliation, but she kept her eyes fixed on Eli as if drawing strength from his steady gaze. He noticed then that she wasn't moving her legs, and understanding hit him like a physical blow. "She had herself a little accident about 2 years ago," Mercer continued, his voice taking on a cruel edge. "Fell from her horse while out riding with some young man who had the good sense to disappear once he realized what he'd be getting himself into. Left her with legs that don't work and a disposition that's gotten considerably worse since then." "Pa, please," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Don't you paw me," Mercer snapped, his mask of civility slipping. "You've been nothing but a burden since the day you fell off that horse. Can't walk, can't work, can't even find yourself a husband now. What good are you?" Eli felt something dark and dangerous stirring in his chest, a familiar rage that he'd thought he'd buried along with his family. He took a step forward, his hand moving closer to his gun. "Easy there, Decker," one of the deputies called out, his own weapon now partially drawn. "The sheriff's just trying to have a conversation." "That's right," Mercer said, his smile returning. "Just a friendly chat between neighbors. You see, I've been thinking about poor Clara here, wondering what's to become of her. She can't stay with me, I've got important work to do, and I can't be nursemaiding a cripple. But then I remembered you living out here all alone, and I thought to myself, now there's a man who could use some company." "You want me to take her," Eli said, and it wasn't a question. "I want you to solve my problem," Mercer replied. "Think of it as a favor to the community. One broken soul helping another, that sort of thing. Very charitable of you." Clara made a sound that might have been a sob, or might have been a snarl of rage. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, and Eli could see the tremor in her shoulders as she fought to maintain her composure. "And if I refuse?" Eli asked. Mercer's smile turned predatory. "Well, that would be unfortunate. You see, I've been looking into your property taxes, Decker, and I'm afraid there might be some irregularities. Nothing that couldn't be sorted out, of course, but it might take some time, might require a few visits from my deputies here to make sure everything's in order." The threat was clear, and Eli felt the familiar weight of helplessness settle on his shoulders. He'd dealt with men like Mercer before, men who used their power like a club, beating down anyone who dared to oppose them. He could fight, of course. He was fast with a gun and had little left to lose, but he'd also seen what happened to men who challenged the sheriff's authority. They had a way of disappearing or having accidents or finding themselves on the wrong end of a legal proceeding that left them with nothing. "She can't work a ranch," he said finally. "Can't ride, can't tend cattle. What exactly am I supposed to do with her?" "That's your problem now, not mine," Mercer replied with a shrug. "Maybe she can cook, clean, that sort of thing. Women's work. Might be nice to have someone keep house for you." He climbed back up onto his wagon and nodded to his deputies. "We'll be heading back to town now. Clara, you be a good girl and don't cause Mr. Decker any trouble, you hear?" Clara didn't respond, but Eli saw her jaw tighten with suppressed emotion. "Oh, and Decker," Mercer called out as he gathered the reins. "Don't get any ideas about bringing her back to town. As far as I'm concerned, she's not my problem anymore. You two can figure out how to make this work or not. Makes no difference to me." With that, he snapped the reins and the wagon lurched into motion. The deputies fell in behind him, and within minutes they were nothing but a dust cloud disappearing into the distance, leaving Eli standing on his porch with a paralyzed young woman lying in the back of an abandoned wagon. The silence stretched between them for a long moment, heavy with the weight of their shared abandonment. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I suppose you're wondering what you're going to do with me." Eli looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the proud set of her shoulders, the defiant tilt of her chin, the way she met his gaze without flinching. She reminded him of a wild horse he'd once tried to break, beautiful, spirited, and absolutely determined not to let the world defeat her. "I suppose I am," he admitted. "Well, you have a few options," she continued, her tone almost conversational. "You could leave me here to die, which would probably be the kindest thing. You could take me back to town and dump me at the church, though I suspect Father Morrison would just send me right back. Or—" She paused, and for the first time since the wagon had arrived, her composure seemed to crack slightly. "Or," Eli prompted, "or you could help me down from this wagon, and we could figure out how to live with this situation we've both been forced into." Eli studied her face, searching for signs of manipulation or deceit, but all he saw was a young woman trying to maintain her dignity in an impossible situation. Something about her reminded him of Sarah, not in appearance, but in the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her core. He made his decision. "Can you use your arms?" he asked. "Yes, it's just my legs that don't work." He nodded and approached the wagon. "I'm going to lift you down. Is there anything I should know?" "Anything that might hurt you." Clara's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected such consideration. "No, just be careful with my legs. They don't have much feeling, but they can still be damaged." Eli climbed up onto the wagon bed and slipped his arms under Clara's knees and shoulders. She was lighter than he'd expected, and as he lifted her, he caught a faint scent of lavender soap clinging to her hair. She kept her arms wrapped around his neck as he carefully climbed down from the wagon, and he could feel the slight tremor in her hands. "Where would you like me to put you?" he asked. "The porch steps, if you don't mind. I'd like to sit up for a while." He carried her to the steps and gently set her down, making sure she was stable before releasing her. She immediately began arranging her skirts to cover her legs, a gesture that spoke of long practice in managing her disability with whatever dignity she could maintain. "Thank you," she said softly. Eli nodded and stepped back, suddenly unsure of what to do next. He'd been living alone for so long that the presence of another person, especially a woman, felt strange and unsettling. "Are you hungry?" he asked finally. "I could eat something." "Thirsty, very." He went into the house and returned with a cup of water and a plate of cold biscuits left over from breakfast. Clara accepted them gratefully, drinking the water in long, steady gulps, as if she'd been dying of thirst. "How long were you in that wagon?" Eli asked. "Since before dawn. He wanted to get an early start, said he had important business in town later." Her voice was bitter, though I suspect his important business was just making sure everyone knew he'd finally gotten rid of his burden. Eli watched her eat, noting the careful way she managed the biscuit, with hands that shook slightly from exhaustion and emotion. "What's your full name?" "Clara Elizabeth Mercer. Though I suppose I'll need to find a new surname now that my father's disowned me." "You don't have to decide that today." She looked up at him with those fierce green eyes. "No, but I'll need to decide it soon. A woman without a name is hardly a woman at all." There was something in the way she said it that made Eli think she'd been contemplating this moment for a long time, that perhaps being abandoned wasn't entirely unwelcome, despite the fear and uncertainty it brought. "Tell me about the accident," he said gently. Clara's face went carefully blank. "What would you like to know?" "Whatever you're willing to share. If I'm going to help you, I need to understand what we're dealing with." She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the horizon, where the sheriff's dust cloud had long since settled. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant, as if she was recounting someone else's story. I was riding with Thomas Whitmore. He was a banker's son from Phoenix in town visiting his aunt. We'd been courting, I suppose you'd call it, though my father never approved. Said Thomas wasn't good enough, wasn't wealthy enough, wasn't important enough. She laughed bitterly. Funny how his standards changed once I became damaged goods. What happened during the ride? Thomas wanted to race. He was always wanting to prove something, always needing to be the fastest, the strongest, the best at everything. I told him my horse wasn't familiar with the terrain, that we should take it slow, but he kept pushing, called me a coward when I hesitated. Eli felt his jaw tighten. He was beginning to get a picture of the kind of man Thomas Whitmore had been. So I raced him, Clara continued. We were flying across the desert neck and neck when my horse stepped in a prairie dog hole. I remember flying through the air, remember hitting the ground so hard it knocked the breath out of me. And then, nothing, just pain and darkness and the sound of Thomas's voice saying, oh God, what have I done? He stayed with you, long enough to see that I couldn't move my legs, long enough to realize what it meant for his future. Her voice was steady, but Eli could see the hurt in her eyes. He rode for help, brought my father and Doc Harrison out to get me. But by the time they arranged our wedding, well, let's just say Thomas had discovered urgent business that required him to return to Phoenix immediately. Bastard, Eli muttered. Clara looked at him with surprise, then smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. That's exactly what I called him, though my father tanned my hide for using such language. Your father seems like a piece of work himself. That's one way to put it. She finished the last of her biscuit and brushed the crumbs from her skirts. Marcus Mercer is a man who measures everything by its usefulness to him. A daughter who can walk, marry well, and produce grandchildren, useful. A daughter who can't walk, can't attract a husband, and requires constant care, not useful. Simple mathematics. The matter-of-fact way she described her own rejection made Eli's heart ache. He recognized the tone. It was the same way he talked about the fire, about losing Sarah and Annie. The voice of someone who had learned to speak about their deepest pain as if it belonged to someone else. What about your mother? He asked. Died when I was 12. Fever took her one winter and my father never remarried. Said he was too busy with important work to worry about finding another wife. Clara's expression darkened. I think the truth is that no woman with any sense would have him. He's not a kind man, Mr. Decker. He never was, even before the accident. Eli nodded, filing this information away. He was beginning to understand that Clara's abandonment was as much about her father's character as it was about her disability. What can you do? He asked. I mean, what are you capable of? If Clara was offended by the directness of the question, she didn't show it. Instead, she seemed to appreciate his practical approach to their situation. I can cook quite well, actually. I can sew, mend clothes, tend a garden. If it's planted in raised beds, I can reach. I can read and write, keep books, handle correspondence. I know how to preserve food, make soap, all the usual domestic skills. She paused, then added with a slight smile, I can also shoot, if that matters. My father taught me when I was young, said a sheriff's daughter should know how to defend herself. That's good to know. Eli found himself impressed by her comprehensive list of skills. What about personal care? Can you manage that yourself? Clara's cheeks colored slightly, but she met his gaze steadily. Yes, I've learned to adapt. I'll need some help with bathing, and getting in and out of bed can be challenging, but I'm not completely helpless. Good. Eli looked around his property mentally, cataloging the changes that would need to be made. This place isn't set up for someone who can't walk. I'll need to build ramps, maybe modify the house some. You're going to let me stay? The hope in her voice was carefully controlled, as if she was afraid to want it too much. Eli was quiet for a moment, thinking. The truth was he was lonely. He'd been alone for so long that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have another person around, to hear a voice other than his own echoing in the empty rooms of his house. And there was something about Clara, her strength, her refusal to feel sorry for herself, her determination to maintain her dignity despite her circumstances, that reminded him of what it felt like to admire someone. "I reckon we could give it a try," he said finally. "See how it works out." Clara closed her eyes and took a deep breath, and when she opened them again, there were tears threatening to spill over. "Thank you," she whispered. "Man, don't thank me yet. This isn't going to be easy for either of us. I'm not used to having people around, and you're going to have to deal with living in the middle of nowhere with a man you don't know." "I understand." "Do you?" Eli studied her face. "This is hard country, Clara. Winters are cold, summers are brutal, and the nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. If something goes wrong, if you get sick or hurt, we're on our own. And I'm not good with people anymore. I've been alone too long. I might not be the best company." Clara smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Eli's chest tighten with an emotion he'd thought he'd lost forever. "Mr. Decker," she said softly, "anything has to be better than being treated like a burden by the people who are supposed to love you. If you're willing to give me a chance to prove I can be useful, to prove I'm worth keeping around, then I'm willing to take whatever risks come with that." Eli found himself nodding before he'd fully made the decision. "All right then, let's see about getting you settled." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of practical arrangements. Eli carried Clara into the house and set her on the sofa in the front room while he figured out the sleeping situation. His house was small, just 3 rooms and a lean-to kitchen with his own bedroom, a small room that had once been Annie's, and the main living area that served as both parlor and dining room. "You can have Annie's room," he told Clara as he showed her around the house. "It's not much, but it's private, and there's a window that faces east, so you'll get morning light." Clara looked around the small room, taking in the child-sized bed, the faded quilt, the shelf of wooden toys that had never been moved. This was your daughter's room. It wasn't a question, and Eli felt his throat tighten. "Yes. I don't want to intrude on her memory." "You're not intruding. The room should be used." He paused, then added more softly, "She would have liked you, I think. Annie always was drawn to people with fight in them." That evening, as the sun sent over the desert in a blaze of orange and gold, Eli sat on his front porch and tried to process the day's events. Inside the house, he could hear Clara moving around the kitchen, the soft sounds of someone preparing a meal. It had been years since his house had held such sounds, and he found them both comforting and unsettling. She'd insisted on cooking dinner despite his protests that she should rest. "I need to feel useful," she'd said firmly, "and you need to eat something better than cold biscuits and coffee." Now the smell of frying bacon and fresh bread was drifting through the open door, and Eli realized he was hungrier than he'd been in months. He'd grown accustomed to eating whatever was convenient, often forgetting meals altogether when he was busy with ranch work. Having someone who cared whether he ate properly felt strange and wonderful. "Dinner's ready," Clara called from the kitchen. Eli found her seated at his small kitchen table, having somehow managed to transfer herself from the living room and prepare a full meal. The table was set with mismatched plates and silverware, and she'd even found a candle somewhere and lit it, casting warm light over the simple fare. "How did you manage all this?" he asked, gesturing at the meal. "Carefully," she replied with a smile. "And with a great deal of determination. I told you I could cook." They ate in companionable silence, the first peaceful meal Eli had shared with another person since before the fire. Clara had prepared bacon, eggs, fresh bread, and coffee that was actually strong enough to taste like something other than brown water. "This is good," he said finally. "Thank you. It feels good to cook for someone again." After dinner, Eli helped Clara get ready for bed, a process that was awkward for both of them, but necessary. He carried her to her room and waited outside while she changed into a nightgown, then helped her get situated in the bed. "Will you be all right?" he asked as he prepared to leave her for the night. "I'll be fine, thank you, Mr. Decker, for everything." "Eli," he corrected. If we're going to be living together, you might as well call me by my name. Eli, she repeated softly, as if testing how it felt on her tongue. Good night, Eli. Good night, Clara. He closed her door and walked back through the quiet house to his own room, but sleep was a long time coming. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft sounds of another person breathing in the room next door. For the first time in 3 years, his house didn't feel empty. But along with the comfort came uncertainty. What had he gotten himself into? How was this arrangement supposed to work? And what would happen when the novelty wore off and the reality of their situation set in? He thought about Sheriff Mercer's cruel joke about the way the man had dumped his own daughter like unwanted trash. The memory made his hands clench into fists. He'd known men like Mercer during the war, officers who saw their soldiers as expendable resources, politicians who measured human worth by how much profit could be extracted from a life. But perhaps Mercer's cruelty had backfired. Perhaps in his attempt to rid himself of a burden, he'd actually given both Eli and Clara something they desperately needed: a second chance at not being alone. As he finally drifted toward sleep, Eli found himself thinking about Clara's green eyes and the way she'd refused to let her circumstances break her spirit. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions to answer, and problems to solve. But for the first time since the fire, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow instead of simply enduring it. In the room next door, Clara lay awake as well, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the enormous change in her circumstances. This morning, she'd been her father's unwanted burden, a source of shame and frustration. Tonight, she was, what exactly? A housekeeper, a ward, a woman starting over in a place where no one knew her story. She thought about Eli's steady gray eyes and the gentle way he'd carried her, the care he'd taken not to hurt her damaged legs. When was the last time someone had touched her with such consideration? When was the last time someone had asked what she was capable of, instead of assuming she was capable of nothing? The bed was comfortable, the room clean and warm, and for the first time in 2 years, Clara felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. Tomorrow she would begin to build a new life, to prove that she was worth more than her father's cruel assessment. She would make herself indispensable, show Eli that taking her in had been a good decision. But beneath the hope lay a deeper truth that she wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. For the first time since her accident, she'd looked at a man and felt something other than fear or shame. There had been kindness in Eli's eyes, and strength, and a loneliness that matched her own. Perhaps they could heal each other. Perhaps two broken people could figure out how to be whole together. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the sage and mesquite, carrying with it the promise of a new day and all the possibilities it might bring. The first rays of dawn were painting the eastern mountains in shades of rose and gold when Clara woke to the sound of someone moving quietly in the kitchen. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. The unfamiliar room, the different quality of light, the absence of her father's heavy footsteps in the hallway. Then memory flooded back the wagon, the abandonment, Eli's steady gray eyes and gentle hands. She lay still for several minutes, listening to the soft sounds of morning preparations. There was something comforting about knowing someone else was awake, that she wasn't facing another day alone with nothing but her own thoughts for company. At her father's house, mornings had been silent affairs. He left early for his rounds, and she'd learned to keep to her room until he was gone to avoid his disapproving glances. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Clara, are you awake?" "Yes," she called softly. "I've got coffee on, and I'm about to start breakfast. Do you need help getting up?" The question was asked matter-of-factly, without pity or awkwardness, and Clara felt a rush of gratitude. "I can manage the getting up part, but I'll need help getting to the kitchen." "Take your time. I'll be here when you're ready." Clara heard his footsteps retreat, and she began the careful process of getting dressed and ready for the day. It was a routine she'd perfected over the past 2 years, though it still required patience and determination. She'd learned to lay out her clothes the night before to keep everything within easy reach of the bed, to move slowly and deliberately to avoid falls that could leave her stranded on the floor. When she was ready, she called for Eli, and he appeared in her doorway within moments. He was dressed for work, denim pants, a cotton shirt rolled up at the sleeves, boots that had seen countless miles of desert terrain. His dark hair was still damp from washing, and she caught a faint scent of soap and leather as he approached the bed. "Good morning," he said, and his voice held a warmth that made something flutter in her chest. "Good morning." She held out her arms, and he lifted her with the same careful consideration he'd shown the day before. As he carried her toward the kitchen, she found herself noticing details she'd missed in yesterday's emotional chaos. The way his arms felt solid and secure around her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the small scar that ran along his left temple. He set her down at the kitchen table, which she noticed had been arranged so that her chair was positioned where she could easily reach everything she might need. It was a small consideration, but it spoke volumes about the kind of man he was. "How did you sleep?" he asked as he moved to the stove where bacon was already sizzling in a cast-iron pan. "Better than I have in months," Clara admitted. "It's been a long time since I felt safe, I suppose." Eli glanced at her over his shoulder, his expression serious. "You are safe here, Clara. Whatever else happens, I want you to know that." The quiet certainty in his voice made her throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you." They ate breakfast together as the sun climbed higher, painting the desert landscape in brilliant golds and oranges. Clara found herself studying Eli's face as he ate, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of too much sun and too little sleep, the careful way he moved his left leg, the moments when his gaze would drift to the window and his expression would grow distant. "Tell me about your ranch," she said finally. "How long have you been here?" 8 years come September. Eli's voice was steady, but she caught something underneath it, a carefully controlled pain. "Built the house myself, cleared most of the land. It's not much, but it's mine." "What made you choose this place?" Eli was quiet for a long moment, and Clara wondered if she'd pushed too hard, asked something too personal. But then he spoke, his voice soft and distant. "After the war, I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere I could think or stop thinking, depending on the day." He looked at her directly. "My wife Sarah always said she wanted to live where she could see the sky from horizon to horizon. This seemed like the kind of place she would have loved." The past tense wasn't lost on Clara, and she felt her heart clench with sympathy. "What happened to her?" "Fire," he said simply. "Took her and our daughter both while I was away on business. By the time I got back," he trailed off, but Clara could see the rest of the story in the tight line of his shoulders, the way his hands clenched around his coffee cup. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. It was a long time ago, but the way he said it told her that time hadn't healed these wounds, only taught him how to carry them. They finished breakfast in thoughtful silence, and then Eli began clearing the dishes. Clara watched him work, noting the efficient way he moved around the small kitchen, and felt a familiar frustration at her own helplessness. "Let me help," she said finally. "Please, I can wash dishes if you bring them to me." Eli paused, a plate in his hands. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Clara's voice was firm. "If I'm going to stay here, I need to contribute. I need to feel useful. Please don't take that away from me." He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but we'll need to figure out a better setup. This table's too low for you to work comfortably." "We'll manage," Clara said with determination. "We'll figure it out." And they did. Over the next hour, they worked together to develop a system that allowed Clara to help with the kitchen work, despite her limitations. Eli brought her a large basin and positioned it on the table at a height she could reach comfortably. He heated water on the stove and brought it to her, along with soap and towels. It wasn't perfect, but it worked, and more importantly, It allowed Clara to feel like she was contributing rather than just being cared for. As she washed the breakfast dishes, Clara found herself thinking about the contrast between this morning and her mornings at her father's house. There, she'd been expected to stay out of the way to make herself as invisible as possible so as not to remind him of his burden. Here, Eli was actively trying to find ways to include her to make her feel valuable. "What needs to be done today?" she asked as she handed him the last clean plate. "I need to check the fence line on the south pasture, make sure none of the cattle have wandered off. There's a section that's been giving me trouble. Posts keep working loose in the sandy soil." He paused, looking at her thoughtfully. "What about you? What would you like to do?" The question caught Clara off guard. When was the last time someone had asked what she wanted to do rather than telling her what she couldn't do? "I'd like to see more of the ranch," she said slowly. "Get a better sense of the place, and maybe we could talk about what changes need to be made to make it easier for me to get around." Eli nodded. "I can hitch up the wagon, take you on a tour. And you're right about the changes we need to think about. Ramps, maybe some modifications to the house." An hour later, Clara found herself seated beside Eli on the bench of his wagon, a worn blanket tucked around her legs to ward off the morning chill. The wagon was sturdy but simple, built for function rather than comfort, and she had to brace herself against the jolting as they made their way across the uneven terrain. But the discomfort was worth it for the chance to see Eli's land properly. From her position on the wagon seat, she could take in the full scope of his property, the house and barn sitting in a small valley protected from the worst of the desert winds. The creek that wandered through the eastern section lined with cottonwoods that provided blessed shade. The pastures where his cattle grazed on hardy desert grass. "It's beautiful," she said softly, and meant it. There was something about the vast openness of the landscape, the way the mountains rose like ancient guardians on the horizon, that spoke to something deep in her soul. "It grows on you," Eli replied. "At first, all that emptiness can feel overwhelming, but after a while you start to appreciate the peace of it, the way you can think out here without the world pressing in on you." They drove in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the distant lowing of cattle. Clara found herself stealing glances at Eli as he drove, noting the way his hands held the reins with practiced ease, the way his eyes constantly scanned the landscape for signs of trouble or change. "There," he said, finally pointing toward a section of fence in the distance. "That's where I need to work today. You can see how the posts are leaning, the ground's too soft to hold them steady." Clara studied the fence line with interest. "What if you buried rocks around the base of the posts, created a more solid foundation?" Eli looked at her with surprise. "That's not a bad idea. Where did you learn about fence construction?" "My father owned some land outside town before he became sheriff. I used to help with the maintenance when I was younger." Clara smiled at the memory. "Back when I was still useful to him." "You're still useful," Eli said firmly. "Don't let his blindness make you forget your worth." The simple statement, delivered with such quiet conviction, made Clara's eyes burn with unshed tears. She turned her face away, pretending to study the landscape while she composed herself. They spent the rest of the morning touring the ranch with Eli, explaining the challenges of desert ranching, and Clara offering observations and suggestions. She had a good eye for practical problems and an intuitive understanding of how to work with the land rather than against it. By the time they returned to the house for lunch, Eli found himself genuinely impressed by her knowledge and insights. "You know more about ranching than I expected," he said as he helped her down from the wagon. "I've always been interested in how things work, how to solve problems." Clara settled herself on the front porch steps while Eli unhitched the horses. "My father used to say it wasn't ladylike to be so curious about such things, but I couldn't help myself." "Sarah was the same way," Eli said softly. "Always asking questions, always wanting to understand the why of things." He led the horses toward the barn, then paused and looked back at her. It's a good quality in a woman. Don't let anyone tell you different. While Eli tended to the horses, Clara sat on the porch and tried to process the morning's revelations. She'd learned more about Eli in a few hours than she'd known about any person in years. The way he spoke about Sarah with such tenderness made it clear that he'd loved his wife deeply, and the pain in his voice when he mentioned the fire told her that grief was still a living thing for him. But there had been moments, brief flashes, when he'd looked at her with something that wasn't quite pity, wasn't quite friendship, but something warmer and more complex. She didn't want to read too much into it, didn't want to mistake kindness for affection, but she couldn't deny the small flutter of hope it created in her chest. When Eli returned from the barn, he found Clara preparing lunch in the kitchen, having somehow managed to transfer herself from the porch and gather ingredients for sandwiches and coffee. "You don't have to do everything," he said, as he washed his hands at the basin. "I want to," Clara replied simply. "It feels good to be useful." They ate lunch on the front porch, enjoying the shade and the slight breeze that had picked up from the west. Clara found herself studying Eli's profile as he ate, noting the strong line of his jaw, the way the sunlight brought out the silver threading through his dark hair. "How old are you?" she asked suddenly, then blushed at her own boldness. "I'm sorry, that was presumptuous." 34, Eli answered without seeming offended by the question. "You, 21 next month." Eli nodded thoughtfully. "You seem older, more settled, I suppose, than most women your age." "Disability has a way of aging you quickly," Clara said with a rueful smile. "You learn to see the world differently when you realize how quickly everything can change." After lunch, Eli set to work on the fence repairs, and Clara settled herself in the kitchen with a basket of mending she'd found in a closet. The domestic routine felt both foreign and foreign, because it had been so long since she'd felt welcome to simply exist in a space familiar, because the rhythms of household work were as natural to her as breathing. As she worked, she could see Eli through the kitchen window, laboring in the hot sun to reset the fence posts. He'd taken off his shirt, and she found herself admiring the play of muscles across his back as he worked. There was something deeply attractive about a man who worked with his hands, who could build and fix and create with nothing but determination and skill. The afternoon wore on, and Clara found herself falling into the peaceful rhythm of domestic life. She mended shirts and socks, prepared vegetables for dinner, and even managed to sweep the kitchen floor by dragging herself around on her hands while pushing the broom ahead of her. It wasn't dignified, but it was effective, and the sense of accomplishment she felt when the task was complete was worth the awkwardness. When Eli returned to the house as the sun was beginning to set, he found Clara in the kitchen putting the finishing touches on what appeared to be a substantial dinner. The table was set with care, candles were lit, and the aroma of roasted chicken and fresh bread filled the air. "This is quite a feast," he said, pausing in the doorway to take in the scene. "I wanted to make something special," Clara replied, not quite meeting his eyes. "To thank you for everything." Eli studied her face, noting the slight flush in her cheeks, the way she seemed nervous about his reaction. "Clara, you don't owe me anything. Certainly not a debt of gratitude. Maybe not a debt," she said softly, "but I wanted to show you that I can contribute, that I'm not just dead weight." The pain in her voice made Eli's chest tighten. He moved closer, stopping just in front of her chair. "Look at me," he said gently. Clara raised her eyes to his, and he was struck again by their fierce green beauty. "You are not dead weight," he said firmly. "You are a woman who's had to overcome tremendous challenges, and you've done it with grace and strength. Any man would be lucky to have you in his life." Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away quickly. "You don't have to say things like that just to be kind." "I'm not being kind, I'm being honest." Eli surprised himself by reaching out and gently tilting her chin up so she had to meet his gaze again. "Your worth isn't determined by what you can or can't do with your legs, Clara. It's determined by who you are as a person, and from what I've seen, you're remarkable." The touch of his fingers against her skin sent a shock of awareness through Clara's entire body. When was the last time a man had touched her face with such tenderness? When was the last time anyone had looked at her like she was something precious rather than something broken? "Eli?" she whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer. For a moment they stayed frozen like that. His fingers against her chin, her eyes locked with his, the air between them charged with possibility. Clara felt her heart racing, felt her breath coming short, felt the dangerous flutter of hope unfurling in her chest. Then Eli seemed to realize what he was doing and dropped his hand, stepping back with a slight shake of his head. "We should eat before the food gets cold." Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The moment had passed, but she could still feel the ghost of his touch on her skin, could still see the flicker of something warm and complex in his gray eyes. They ate dinner by candlelight, the conversation flowing more easily than Clara would have expected given the charged moment in the kitchen. Eli complimented the food genuinely and enthusiastically, and Clara found herself glowing under his praise. It had been so long since anyone had appreciated something she'd created, had seen value in her efforts. "Tell me about your life before the accident," Eli said as they finished the main course. "What were you like as a young woman?" Clara considered the question thoughtfully. "Different," she said finally. "More carefree, I suppose. I loved to ride, spent hours on horseback, exploring the countryside around town. I had friends, went to social gatherings, even had a few suitors before Thomas came along." She smiled sadly. "I was planning to be married, to have children, to live the kind of conventional life young women are expected to want." "Do you miss it? That life you were planning?" "Sometimes," Clara admitted. "But I think I've changed too much to go back to being that person, even if I could walk again. The accident taught me things about myself that I might never have learned otherwise. About strength, about what really matters, about who I am when everything else is stripped away." Eli nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that. The war changed me in similar ways, made me see things differently, value different things." "Do you ever regret it? The changes, I mean." "No," Eli said after a moment's consideration. "I regret the pain that caused them, but not the changes themselves. They made me more real, I suppose, more honest about what life actually is, rather than what we pretend it should be." After dinner, they moved to the front porch to enjoy the cooler evening air. Eli carried Clara outside and settled her in one of the wooden chairs he'd positioned to catch the evening breeze. The desert sky was beginning its nightly transformation, the harsh blue of day giving way to the soft pastels of sunset. "It's beautiful here," Clara said softly, watching the colors shift and change across the vast canvas of sky. "It grows on you," Eli replied, settling into the chair beside her. "At first it can feel lonely, all that space, all that silence. But after a while you start to appreciate it, the peace of it." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Clara found herself stealing glances at Eli's profile, noting the way the fading light softened the harsh lines of his face, the way his eyes seemed to hold depths she was only beginning to understand. "Eli," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, thank you. For taking me in, for treating me like a person instead of a problem to be solved." He turned to look at her, and in the gathering twilight his eyes seemed to hold something warm and indefinable. "Clara, you are a person, a remarkable one. Don't let anyone ever convince you otherwise." As full darkness settled over the desert, they remained on the porch, talking quietly about their hopes and fears, their past disappointments and tentative dreams for the future. It was the kind of conversation Clara hadn't had in years, honest, intimate, free from judgment or expectation. When Eli finally carried her inside and helped her prepare for bed, There was a new ease between them, a sense of connection that hadn't existed the night before. As he set her gently on her bed and said goodnight, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since before her accident, the warm glow of being truly seen and valued by another person. "Good night, Eli," she whispered. "Good night, Clara. Sweet dreams." As he closed her door softly behind him, Clara lay back against her pillows and smiled in the darkness. For the first time in 2 years, she was looking forward to tomorrow, to the possibility of building something meaningful with this quiet, wounded man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. In his own room, Eli lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind churning with thoughts and emotions he'd thought buried with Sarah and Annie. There was no denying the attraction he felt toward Clara, the way her green eyes seemed to see straight through to his soul, the grace with which she handled her circumstances, the strength that radiated from her despite everything she'd endured. But attraction was dangerous territory for a man like him, a man who'd already lost everything once and had no desire to risk such pain again. Clara deserved better than a broken-down rancher carrying more grief than hope. She deserved someone who could love her without reservation, without the shadows of the past clouding every moment. Yet as he lay there listening to the soft sounds of her breathing through the thin wall that separated their rooms, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, they could heal each other. Maybe two people who'd been broken by life could find a way to be whole together. The thought both terrified and thrilled him, and it was a long time before sleep finally claimed him, carrying him into dreams where green eyes and auburn hair danced just beyond his reach. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised them both with its natural ease. Clara woke each morning to the sound of Eli moving quietly through the house, preparing for another day of ranch work, and she found herself looking forward to those first moments of consciousness when she could lie in bed and listen to the familiar sounds of his morning routine. By the end of their first week together, Eli had begun construction on a series of ramps that would allow Clara to move more freely around the property. He worked on them in the evenings after his ranch duties were done, the sound of hammer and saw creating a steady rhythm that Clara found oddly comforting as she prepared dinner or mended clothes by lamplight. "You don't have to do all this work for me," she told him one evening as she watched him measure boards for the ramp that would connect the front porch to the main yard. "I'm not doing it just for you," Eli replied, not looking up from his work. "I'm doing it for us. If this arrangement is going to work, we both need to be able to function here." The casual way he said "us" sent a warm flutter through Clara's chest, though she tried not to read too much into it. Still, there was something in the way he included her in his plans for the ranch, the way he asked for her input on everything from fence repairs to the placement of the garden, that made her feel like she belonged here in a way she'd never belonged anywhere else. On a particularly warm afternoon during their second week together, Clara was sitting on the front porch working on a quilt when she heard the sound of approaching horses. She looked up to see 3 riders cresting the hill that led to the ranch, and her heart immediately began racing as she recognized the familiar figure of her father in the lead. Sheriff Mercer rode with his usual arrogant posture, flanked by 2 of his deputies. They approached at a leisurely pace, as if they had all the time in the world, but Clara could see the tension in her father's shoulders, the way his hand rested casually near his gun. Eli emerged from the barn where he'd been working, and Clara could see him taking in the situation with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to assess danger quickly. He moved toward the house with deceptive casualness, positioning himself between the approaching riders and Clara. "Afternoon, Sheriff," Eli called out as the men drew their horses to a halt in front of the porch. "What brings you out this way?" Mercer's pale eyes swept over the scene, taking in the half-finished ramp, the domestic tranquility of the porch where Clara sat with her sewing, the obvious signs that she'd been integrated into life on the ranch. His expression darkened with something that might have been disappointment. Just checking on my property, Mercer said with false geniality, making sure everything's in order. Your property. Eli's voice remained level, but Clara could hear the steel beneath it. My daughter, of course. Just because I left her in your care doesn't mean I've given up my parental rights. Mercer dismounted and approached the porch, his deputies remaining on their horses but keeping their hands near their weapons. Clara felt her stomach clench with familiar dread, but she forced herself to sit straighter to meet her father's gaze without flinching. She would not let him see her cower, would not give him the satisfaction of knowing how his presence still affected her. "Hello, father," she said coolly. "Clara." Mercer's eyes swept over her, taking in her neat appearance, the healthy color in her cheeks, the obvious signs of contentment. "You look, well, better than I expected, actually." "Thank you. Ranch life agrees with me." Mercer's gaze shifted to Eli, and Clara saw something calculating in his expression. "I have to admit, Decker, I'm impressed. When I left her here, I half expected to come back and find you'd dumped her at the church or left her to fend for herself. But it looks like you've actually managed to make some use of her." The casual cruelty of his words made Clara's hands clench in her lap, but before she could respond, Eli stepped forward. "Clara isn't property to be used, Sheriff. She's a person, and she's proven herself to be a valuable partner in running this ranch." "Partner." Mercer laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the yard. "That's a generous way to describe keeping a cripple as a charity case." "Father, please," Clara said quietly, hating the way her voice trembled slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. "Don't father me." Mercer snapped, his mask of civility slipping. "You lost the right to call me that when you became useless, when you became an embarrassment." Eli's hand moved to rest on the butt of his gun, a subtle but unmistakable gesture that didn't go unnoticed by anyone present. "I think you've said enough." "Have I?" Mercer's eyes glittered with malicious amusement. "See, that's the thing about charity, Decker. It's all well and good when it's new, and you're feeling noble about helping the less fortunate. But charity gets old fast, especially when it's the kind that can't walk away when you get tired of it." Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes, felt the familiar shame and worthlessness that her father's words always brought rushing back. But then she felt something else, a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. "You're wrong," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I'm not charity and I'm not useless. I'm a cook. I clean, I mend and sew and keep books. I help with ranch decisions, and I contribute to this household in ways that matter." "Is that what he's told you?" Mercer asked with false sympathy. "Poor girl, don't you see what's happening here? He's being kind now because it's easy, because you're grateful and undemanding. But what happens when he meets a woman who can actually walk? What happens when he wants a wife who can give him children, who can stand beside him at social gatherings, who won't be a constant reminder of his own charitable impulses?" The words hit Clara like physical blows, each one designed to strike at her deepest insecurities. She saw Eli's jaw tighten, saw the flash of anger in his gray eyes, but her father's poison was already working its way through her system. "You see," Mercer continued, noting Clara's stricken expression with satisfaction, "deep down you know I'm right. You know this little fantasy can't last. So why don't you stop embarrassing yourself and come home where you belong?" "She belongs here." Eli's voice cut through the air like a blade. "And if you can't see her worth, that says everything about you and nothing about her." Mercer turned his attention back to Eli, his expression hardening. "Careful, Decker. You're talking to a representative of the law. I'm talking to a man who abandoned his daughter like she was garbage." Eli replied evenly, "The badge doesn't change that." For a moment, Clara thought her father might actually go for his gun. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, and she could see the deputies shifting nervously in their saddles. But then Mercer seemed to gather himself, forcing his expression back into its usual mask of cold authority. "I came here to offer Clara one last chance to come home," he said with icy precision. to give her the opportunity to stop living as a burden on the charity of strangers, but I can see she's chosen to continue down this path of delusion. He turned back to Clara, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been genuine sadness beneath all the cruelty. When this ends badly, and it will end badly, don't come crawling back to me looking for sympathy. You've made your choice. He remounted his horse and gathered the reins, pausing to look down at Eli one more time. Enjoy playing the noble savior while it lasts, Decker. But remember what I said about charity. It always gets old eventually. With that, he spurred his horse and rode away, his deputies falling in behind him. They disappeared over the hill in a cloud of dust, leaving behind only the echoing sound of hoofbeats and the acrid taste of confrontation. Clara sat frozen on the porch, her sewing fallen forgotten in her lap, her hands shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and emotion. Eli remained standing in the yard, watching the dust settle, his expression unreadable. "Clara," he said finally, his voice gentle. She looked up at him, and he saw the devastation in her green eyes, the way her father's words had stripped away the confidence and contentment she'd been building over the past 2 weeks. "Is he right?" she whispered. "Am I just charity to you?" Eli felt his heart break a little at the pain in her voice. He moved to the porch and knelt down beside her chair, taking her trembling hands in his steady ones. "Look at me," he said softly. Clara raised her eyes to his, and he saw all the old fears and insecurities that her father had so expertly awakened. "Your father is a cruel man who measures worth by all the wrong standards," Eli said firmly. "You are not charity, Clara. You are not a burden. You are a woman of strength and intelligence and grace, and any man would be fortunate to have you in his life. But what if he's right about the future? What if you do get tired of this arrangement?" Eli was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I can't predict the future, Clara. I don't know what tomorrow will bring for either of us, but I can tell you that having you here has made my life better in ways I didn't even realize I needed. You've brought warmth and purpose and hope back into this house." Clara felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but they were different from the tears her father's words had brought. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something that felt dangerously close to love. "I was so afraid," she admitted. "When I saw him coming, I was afraid he was going to take me away, and I realized I don't want to leave. This feels like home in a way nowhere ever has before." Eli squeezed her hands gently. "Then stay. As long as you want to be here, you have a place here." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Clara found herself thinking about her father's visit and the emotions it had stirred up. The confrontation had been painful, but it had also clarified something important for her. She was no longer the broken, dependent woman who had been dumped on Eli's doorstep. She had found strength here, purpose, and something that felt like the beginning of genuine happiness. "Eli," she said softly, as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Thank you for standing up to him, for defending me." Eli turned to look at her, noting the way the lamplight from inside the house cast a warm glow across her face. "You don't need to thank me for that, Clara. You're worth defending." "I know that now," she said, and there was a new strength in her voice that hadn't been there before. "But for a while today, I forgot. He has a way of making me feel small, worthless, like I'm nothing but a mistake that needs to be hidden away." "You're not a mistake. You're not something to be hidden. You're—" Eli paused, struggling to find the right words. "You're the best thing that's happened to me in a very long time." Clara felt her breath catch at the intensity in his voice. She turned to look at him fully, seeing something in his gray eyes that made her pulse quicken. "Eli," she whispered. "Clara, He stopped, seeming to struggle with something internal. "I need you to know that what's happening between us, it's not pity. It's not charity, it's... What is it? Clara asked softly when he trailed off. I don't know, he admitted. I thought I was done with feeling anything for anyone. After Sarah and Annie died, I thought that part of me died too. But being with you, it's awakened something I thought was gone forever. Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs. What are you saying? Eli was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face in the dim light. I'm saying that somewhere along the way you stopped being the woman I took in out of obligation and started being the woman I can't imagine living without. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and danger. Clara felt as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that one more step would send her tumbling into territory from which there might be no return. I feel the same way, she whispered, finally, the admission torn from somewhere deep in her chest. I know I shouldn't. I know it's complicated and probably foolish, but I can't help it. Being here with you, it feels like coming alive again after being dead for 2 years. Eli reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his calloused palm. Clara, I know it's not simple, she said quickly, as if afraid he might change his mind if she gave him time to think. I know I come with complications, that I can't be the kind of wife most men would want, but if there's a chance, if there's any possibility that we could make this work. Clara, Eli said again, his thumb brushing gently across her cheek, you are exactly the kind of woman I want. Not in spite of everything you've been through, but because of how you've handled it, because of who you've become. He leaned closer, and Clara felt her eyes drift closed as his lips brushed against hers in a kiss that was gentle and sweet and full of promise. It was her first kiss since the accident, the first time a man had touched her with desire rather than pity, and it awakened something in her that she'd thought lost forever. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing unsteadily. Clara opened her eyes to find Eli looking at her with an expression of wonder and something that might have been reverence. Are you sure about this? She asked softly. About us? I'm sure that I want to find out, Eli replied. Are you? Clara thought about all the reasons this was dangerous, all the ways it could end in heartbreak for both of them. But then she thought about the loneliness of the past 2 years, about the way Eli made her feel valued and desired and whole. Yes, she whispered, I'm sure. The weeks that followed their first kiss were like a courtship conducted in slow motion, each small gesture and shared glance carrying the weight of growing affection and deepening trust. Eli continued to work on modifications to the ranch that would make Clara's life easier, not just ramps now, but a raised garden bed positioned where she could tend it from her chair, modifications to the kitchen that put everything within her reach, a special seat in the wagon that would allow her to accompany him on longer trips around the property. Clara threw herself into making the ranch a true home, using skills she'd forgotten she possessed to create beauty and comfort in their shared space. She made new curtains for the windows, planted flowers around the porch, even convinced Eli to help her rearrange the furniture to create more intimate conversation areas. Their physical relationship progressed slowly, carefully, with the kind of reverent attention that spoke of genuine care rather than mere desire. Eli seemed to understand instinctively that Clara needed time to feel comfortable with intimacy again, that her disability had created insecurities that required patience and tenderness to overcome. One evening in late October, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Clara found herself studying Eli's profile as he read a letter that had arrived from town earlier in the day. The lamplight played across his features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples. Is everything all right? She asked, noting the slight frown creasing his brow. It's from the territorial governor's office, Eli said, folding the letter carefully. They're organizing a territorial council meeting in Phoenix next month. They want representatives from each county to attend, discuss issues affecting ranchers and farmers. That sounds important. It is. There are problems with water rights, land disputes, questions about statehood. The kind of things that could affect everyone out here. He paused, looking at her thoughtfully. They want me to represent this county. Clara felt a flutter of pride at the recognition of Eli's standing in the community. You should go. It would mean being away for at least 2 weeks, maybe longer. I can manage things here while you're gone. Eli shook his head. Clara, I can't leave you alone for that long. What if something happened? What if you got hurt or sick? Then I would deal with it, Clara said firmly. Eli, I'm not helpless. I've been managing on my own for 2 years. I can certainly handle a couple of weeks. That was before. He gestured vaguely, and Clara understood what he couldn't quite say. That was before she'd become precious to him, before the thought of losing her had become unbearable. Before what? She pressed gently. Before I mattered to you. Yes, he admitted quietly. Clara felt her heart swell with warmth at his reluctant admission. That's exactly why you should trust me to be fine while you're gone. Because I matter to you, and because I matter to myself now, in a way I didn't before. I'm not the same broken woman you took in 2 months ago, Eli. You helped me remember who I am. Eli was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the decision. Finally, he looked at her directly. What if I asked you to come with me? Clara's eyebrows rose in surprise. To Phoenix. Why not? You could see the city, meet new people. It might be good for you to get away from here for a while. And do what while you're in meetings all day? Sit in a hotel room feeling sorry for myself. You could explore, go shopping, visit the library. Phoenix is a real city, Clara. There are things there you can't get out here in the desert. Clara considered the suggestion, feeling a flutter of excitement at the thought of seeing new places, experiencing life beyond the ranch. But then reality intruded. How would we explain my presence, an unmarried woman traveling with a bachelor rancher? Eli was quiet for so long that Clara wondered if he'd heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was so soft she had to strain to hear it. We could get married before we go. The words seemed to surprise him as much as they surprised her. Clara felt her heart stop, then begin racing at double speed. Married, she whispered. Eli turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious. Clara, I know this is sudden, and I know we haven't talked about the future in concrete terms. But the truth is, I can't imagine a future that doesn't include you. These past 2 months you've become everything to me. Clara felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. Eli. I know I'm not much of a catch, he continued quickly, as if afraid she might interrupt with a refusal. I'm older than you, I'm damaged in my own ways, and I can't promise you the kind of comfortable life you might have had with someone else. But I can promise you that I'll love you and protect you and cherish you for as long as I live. Clara reached out with trembling fingers and touched his face, feeling the slight roughness of his evening beard beneath her palm. You foolish man, she whispered. Don't you know you're everything I never dared to hope for? Is that a yes? That's a yes. Clara breathed, and then she was in his arms, being held against his chest, while he whispered endearments into her hair. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Copper Ridge, with only the minister and his wife as witnesses. Clara wore a new dress of deep blue silk that Eli had ordered specially from Phoenix, and she carried a bouquet of desert wildflowers that he'd gathered for her that morning. Sheriff Mercer was conspicuously absent, though Clara caught sight of him watching from across the street as they left the church. For a moment, their eyes met, and she saw something in his expression that might have been regret. But then he turned away, and Clara decided she didn't care what her father thought. This was her day, her choice, her new beginning. That night, in the intimacy of their shared bedroom, Eli showed Clara with infinite patience and tenderness that her disability didn't make her any less desirable, any less capable of giving and receiving pleasure. He worshipped her body with his hands and mouth, finding ways to bring her joy that transcended any physical limitations, proving with every caress that she was beautiful and wanted, and perfect exactly as she was. As they lay entwined afterward, Clara tracing lazy patterns on Eli's chest while he played with her hair, she felt a contentment unlike anything she'd ever experienced. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Eli replied, his arms tightening around her. "My brave, beautiful wife." 2 days later, they set off for Phoenix in Eli's wagon, now fitted with special cushions and supports to make the long journey more comfortable for Clara, as they crested the hill that would take them away from the ranch. Clara looked back at the place that had become her sanctuary, her home the setting for her transformation from abandoned daughter to beloved wife. The future stretched ahead of them, full of uncertainties and challenges, but also full of promise. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, two wounded souls who had found healing in each other's arms, two broken hearts that had somehow become whole. The journey to Phoenix took 4 days, each mile, carrying them further from the familiar desert landscapes of home and deeper into territory that seemed both exciting and vaguely threatening to Clara. She had never been more than 20 miles from Copper Ridge in her entire life, and the vastness of the Arizona territory stretched before them like an ocean of possibilities and dangers. Eli had planned their route carefully, ensuring they would reach settlements with proper accommodations each evening. He'd written ahead to reserve rooms at respectable hotels, explaining Clara's needs in terms that were both discreet and practical. The responses had been uniformly accommodating. It seemed that word of the territorial council meetings had preceded them, and innkeepers were eager to serve the delegates and their families. On their second day of travel, they encountered their first real test as husband and wife when they arrived at the Sunset Inn in a dusty mining town called Goldfield. The proprietor, a heavy-set man with suspicious eyes and tobacco-stained teeth, looked Clara up and down with undisguised curiosity as Eli carried her from the wagon. "You'll be wanting 2 rooms, I expect," the man said with a knowing smirk. "1 room," Eli replied firmly, "for myself and my wife." The innkeeper's eyebrows rose. "Your wife, you say? Forgive me, but she seems incapacitated. Are you certain she's up to the rigors of matrimony?" Clara felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but before she could respond, Eli's voice cut through the air like a blade. "My wife's capabilities are not your concern. We'll take the room you've reserved for us, and we'll expect the same courtesy you'd show any other married couple." The authority in Eli's tone seemed to penetrate the innkeeper's thick skull, and the man quickly nodded, suddenly eager to please. Of course, my apologies, sir. Right this way." As they settled into their room that evening, Clara found herself thinking about the encounter and what it meant for their future together. "Is it always going to be like that?" she asked, as Eli helped her prepare for bed. "People questioning whether we're really married, whether I'm really capable of being a wife." Eli paused in his task of laying out her nightgown, his expression growing thoughtful. "Some people will always judge what they don't understand," he said finally, "but that's their failing, not ours. We know what we are to each other, Clara. That's what matters. But it bothers you too, doesn't it? The stares, the whispers, the assumptions people make." Eli sat down on the edge of the bed beside her, taking her hands in his. "What bothers me is when people treat you as less than you are, when they see only your disability instead of the remarkable woman you've become. But their ignorance doesn't change how I feel about you or how proud I am to call you my wife." Clara squeezed his hands, drawing strength from his steady presence. "I love you for saying that, but I also need you to be honest with me about what we're facing. This is just the beginning, isn't it? The questions, the skepticism, the need to constantly prove ourselves." "Probably," Eli admitted. "But Clara, every marriage faces challenges. Every couple has to prove themselves worthy of the commitment they've made. At least our challenges are visible. We know what we're up against." The wisdom in his words comforted her, and as they settled into sleep that night, Clara found herself feeling more secure about their future together. They had faced their first test as a married couple and emerged stronger for it. Phoenix, when they finally reached it on the fourth day, was unlike anything Clara had ever imagined. The territorial capital was a bustling metropolis of nearly 5,000 people, with wide streets lined with substantial buildings, electric lights that turned night into day, and more activity in a single block than Copper Ridge saw in a month. Their hotel, the Maricopa House, was a 3-story brick building with elegant furnishings and modern conveniences that left Clara speechless with wonder. Their room featured gas lighting, running water, and a view of the bustling street below that provided endless entertainment. "It's incredible," Clara breathed as she sat by the window, watching the stream of humanity flow past on the sidewalk below. So many people, so much life. Eli smiled at her obvious delight. "Would you like to explore some while I'm in meetings tomorrow? I could arrange for someone to escort you, show you around." "Could I mean, would that be proper? You're a married woman now, Clara. You can go wherever you please, as long as it's safe." The next morning, Eli departed for the territorial council meetings, leaving Clara with detailed instructions on how to summon help if she needed it, and a promise to return by late afternoon. Clara had initially felt anxious about being alone in such a large, unfamiliar place, but her nervousness quickly gave way to excitement as she realized the freedom her new status as a married woman had granted her. She spent the morning exploring the hotel's public areas, marveling at the electric lights and modern conveniences, striking up conversations with other guests and staff who seemed charmed by her curiosity and enthusiasm. After lunch, feeling bolder, she ventured out onto the sidewalk in the wheelchair Eli had purchased for her use during their stay. The streets of Phoenix were a revelation. Clara had never seen such diversity of people in pursuits: businessmen in fine suits rushing to important meetings, ladies in fashionable dresses browsing shop windows, cowboys and miners rubbing shoulders with bankers and politicians. She visited a bookstore that contained more volumes than she'd seen in her entire life, a dry goods store with fabrics and notions from around the world, and even a photography studio where she impulsively decided to have her portrait taken as a surprise for Eli. It was while she was wheeling herself back toward the hotel in the late afternoon that she encountered the woman who would change the trajectory of her entire stay in Phoenix. "Excuse me," called a refined voice from behind her. "Might I have a word?" Clara turned to see an elegantly dressed woman of perhaps 45 years approaching with a warm smile. She was tall and graceful, with prematurely silver hair arranged in a fashionable style and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "I'm Margaret Thornton," the woman said, extending her hand. "I couldn't help but notice you navigating our streets with such determination. I wanted to introduce myself." "Clara Decker," Clara replied, accepting the handshake and immediately liking this direct, friendly woman. "Mrs. Decker, I wonder if you might join me for tea. There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Intrigued, Clara agreed and soon found herself seated in an elegant tea room across from this fascinating stranger who seemed to know everyone in Phoenix and commanded respect wherever she went. "I'll get straight to the point, Mrs. Decker," Margaret said as they settled in with their tea. "I represent a group of women here in Phoenix who are working to improve conditions for people with disabilities. We've been advocating for better access to public buildings, employment opportunities, and social acceptance for those who face physical challenges." Clara nearly choked on her tea. "I'm sorry, what? You heard me correctly. We believe that people like yourself, intelligent, capable individuals who happen to have physical limitations, deserve the same opportunities and respect as anyone else. And frankly, we need advocates who understand the challenges firsthand." Clara stared at Margaret in amazement. "There are others who think the way you do. Oh, my dear, there are more of us than you might imagine. The disability rights movement is growing throughout the country. We're organizing, advocating, refusing to accept the notion that physical limitations should mean social invisibility. For the next 2 hours, Margaret regaled Clara with stories of the work they were doing, lobbying for legislation to require ramps in public buildings, establishing employment programs for people with disabilities, even organizing social events to bring together families affected by similar challenges. "The question is," Margaret said finally, "would you be interested in getting involved? Your husband is here for the territorial council meetings, which tells me you have connections to people with influence, and you obviously have intelligence and determination. We could use someone like you." Clara felt her mind reeling with possibilities. "What exactly would you want me to do? Help us organize a presentation for the territorial council. Show them that disability rights are civil rights, that accommodating people with physical challenges isn't charity, it's justice." When Eli returned to their hotel room that evening, he found Clara practically vibrating with excitement as she told him about her encounter with Margaret Thornton and the disability rights advocates. "They want me to speak to the territorial council," Clara said, her green eyes blazing with purpose. "They want me to tell my story, to show the delegates that people like me can be productive, contributing members of society if we're just given the opportunity." Eli listened with growing amazement as Clara described the work Margaret's group was doing, the changes they were advocating for, the vision they had of a society that didn't automatically dismiss people based on physical limitations. "What do you think?" Clara asked finally. "Would you support me in doing this?" "Clara," Eli said slowly, "I think it's exactly what you were meant to do." The next week was a whirlwind of preparation. Clara worked with Margaret and the other advocates to craft a presentation that would be both compelling and practical. They gathered statistics on the number of people in the territory who lived with disabilities, documented the economic impact of excluding them from full participation in society, and developed specific recommendations for legislative action. Clara also spent hours refining her personal testimony, working to strike the right balance between honesty about the challenges she faced and optimism about what was possible with the right support and opportunities. "The key," Margaret explained during one of their planning sessions, "is to help them see you as a person first, not a disability. Show them your intelligence, your capabilities, your contributions. Make them understand that accommodating people like you isn't about charity. It's about recognizing the full potential of all citizens." As the day of the presentation approached, Clara found herself battling nervousness, unlike anything she'd experienced since her wedding day. The Territorial Council included some of the most powerful men in Arizona, men who would literally shape the future of the territory and eventually the state. What if they dismissed her as a curiosity? What if they saw her presentation as an inappropriate intrusion into serious political matters? The night before she was scheduled to speak, Clara sat in their hotel room trying to calm her racing thoughts, while Eli worked on his own presentation about water rights and land use issues. "What if I fail?" she asked suddenly. "What if I make things worse for people like me instead of better?" Eli looked up from his papers, seeing the genuine fear in her eyes. He set aside his work and moved to sit beside her on the bed. "Clara," he said gently, "do you remember what you were like when your father first brought you to my ranch?" "Broken," she said immediately. "Defeated, ready to give up." "No." Eli shook his head. "You were hurt, yes. Discouraged, certainly. But even then, even in that first conversation we had on my front porch, I could see the fire in you, the refusal to accept that your life was over just because it had changed." Clara leaned against his shoulder, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Sometimes I feel like I'm still that broken woman just pretending to be strong." "We're all pretending to be stronger than we feel sometimes," Eli replied. "But Clara, what you've accomplished in the past few months isn't pretending. You've transformed not just yourself, but me as well. You've turned a house into a home, a lonely man into a husband, a routine existence into a life worth living. If you can do all that, you can certainly stand up in front of a group of politicians and remind them of their duty to all citizens. Clara felt tears prick her eyes at his words, but they were tears of gratitude rather than fear. "How did I get so lucky as to find you?" "I think we found each other," Eli replied softly. "And tomorrow, you're going to help a lot of other people find their voices too." The Territorial Council meeting was held in the largest conference room of the Maricopa House, with delegates seated around an enormous oak table while observers filled chairs along the walls. Clara had arrived early with Margaret and the other advocates, wanting to familiarize herself with the space and calm her nerves before the formal proceedings began. As the delegates filed in, Clara recognized several faces from descriptions Eli had given her: territorial legislators, prominent ranchers, and businessmen representatives from various counties throughout Arizona. They were without exception white men of middle age or older men who had built their careers and reputations in a world where people like Clara were largely invisible. When the time came for her presentation, Margaret stood to introduce her, providing context for the disability rights advocacy work and explaining why the Territorial Council should consider these issues as part of their broader legislative agenda. "Gentlemen," Margaret concluded, "I'd like you to meet Mrs. Clara Decker, who will speak to you today not as a victim seeking pity, but as a citizen demanding justice." Clara felt every eye in the room turn to her as Eli helped position her wheelchair at the front of the room. For a moment the silence was deafening, and she could feel the weight of skepticism and curiosity pressing down on her. Then she looked out at the faces before her and saw something that surprised her: genuine interest, even respect. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and strong, "my name is Clara Decker, and I'm here today to talk to you about the largest underutilized resource in the Arizona Territory, its citizens with disabilities." Over the next 20 minutes, Clara delivered the presentation she and Margaret had crafted, weaving together personal testimony with hard data and specific policy recommendations. She spoke about the economic impact of excluding capable people from the workforce simply because they couldn't walk or see or hear in the conventional way. She talked about the practical benefits of making public buildings accessible to all citizens. She challenged them to imagine a territory where every person could contribute their unique talents and perspectives to building a better future. But it was when she spoke about her own journey that the room fell completely silent. "6 months ago," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "I was considered worthless by my own family. I was told I was a burden-damaged goods, someone to be hidden away rather than included in the life of the community. Today, I run a ranch alongside my husband. I manage our finances, make critical decisions about livestock and land use, and contribute to our household success in ways that have nothing to do with whether I can walk." She paused, making eye contact with several delegates who were leaning forward with obvious interest. "The difference wasn't a miracle cure or a change in my physical condition. The difference was one person, my husband, who saw my capabilities instead of my limitations, who provided the support and accommodation I needed to contribute fully to our shared life. That's all most people with disabilities are asking, for the chance to prove what we can do when given the opportunity." When Clara finished her presentation, the room remained quiet for several long seconds. Then slowly, one delegate began to clap, followed by another, and then the entire room erupted in applause that lasted nearly a full minute. The questions that followed were thoughtful and substantive. The delegates wanted to know about specific accommodations that would make the greatest difference, about the costs and benefits of various accessibility measures, about how other territories and states were addressing these issues. Clara answered each question with the poise and knowledge she'd developed through weeks of preparation, but also with the authenticity that came from having lived the experiences she was describing. By the time the session ended, several delegates had approached her with requests for written copies of her recommendations and promises to introduce relevant legislation in the next territorial assembly. That evening, as Clara and Eli celebrated with Margaret and the other advocates, Clara felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she'd ever experienced. She had found her voice, her purpose, her way of making a difference in the world. "You were magnificent," Eli told her as they prepared for bed that night. "I've never been more proud of anyone in my life." "I couldn't have done it without you," Clara replied. "Without the confidence you helped me build the belief that I had something valuable to offer." "You always had something valuable to offer, Clara. I just helped you remember it." As they lay together that night, Clara found herself thinking about the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months ago, she'd been discarded by her father like unwanted baggage. Tonight, she was a respected advocate who had spoken truth to power and been heard. But even more than the public triumph, she treasured the private victory of the love she'd found with Eli. Their marriage had given her not just security and companionship, but the foundation she needed to discover who she really was and what she was capable of becoming. The remainder of their stay in Phoenix flew by in a blur of meetings, social events, and planning sessions. Clara found herself increasingly drawn into the work of the disability rights advocates, even agreeing to help establish a corresponding organization back in Copper Ridge and the surrounding counties. On their final evening in the city, she and Eli attended a formal dinner hosted by the territorial governor for all the council delegates and their wives. Clara wore her finest dress, a creation of deep emerald silk that Eli had insisted on purchasing for the occasion, and she felt every inch the equal of the other women present. As they made their way through the receiving line, Clara was struck by how differently people treated her now compared to their first encounters in the city. Word of her presentation to the Territorial Council had spread, and she was approached throughout the evening by people who wanted to discuss disability rights, share their own family experiences, or simply express their admiration for her courage. "Mrs. Decker," said the territorial governor as they reached the head of the receiving line, "I've heard remarkable things about your presentation to the council. I understand you've given our delegates much to think about." "I hope so, Governor," Clara replied with a smile. "Change is never easy, but it's necessary if we want to build a territory that truly serves all its citizens." "Well said. And Mr. Decker, you must be very proud of your wife's accomplishments." "Every day?" Eli replied, his hand resting protectively on Clara's shoulder. "She continues to amaze me with her strength and wisdom." As they moved through the evening, Clara noticed something that filled her with quiet satisfaction. She and Eli were being treated not as an oddity or curiosity, but as a respected couple whose opinions and insights were valued. The transformation in her social standing was as dramatic as her personal transformation had been. During the carriage ride back to their hotel, Clara found herself reflecting on everything that had changed in her life since that terrible day when her father had abandoned her at Eli's ranch. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if my father had made a different choice that day?" she asked as they rode through the lamplit streets. "If he'd kept me at home or sent me to live with relatives?" Eli considered the question seriously. "I think you would have found your strength eventually," he said finally. "Maybe it would have taken longer, maybe the path would have been different, but you have too much fire in you to stay defeated forever." "But would we have found each other?" "I don't know," Eli admitted. "But I'm grateful every day that we did find each other, however it happened. Even if it started with your father's cruelty, it led us to something beautiful." Clara nodded, understanding what he meant. Her father had intended his abandonment of her as the cruelest punishment he could devise, but it had actually been the catalyst for the greatest happiness of her life. The next morning, as they prepared to leave Phoenix and return to their ranch, Clara felt a mixture of excitement and sadness. She was eager to get back to the home they'd built together, to the life they'd created in the desert. But she was also sad to leave behind the community of advocates she'd discovered, the sense of being part of something larger than herself. "This doesn't have to be goodbye," Margaret reminded her as they said their farewells. "We'll stay in touch, coordinate our efforts across the territory. What you started here is just the beginning. As their wagon rolled out of Phoenix and back into the familiar desert landscape, Clara found herself thinking about Margaret's words. What she had started here was indeed just the beginning, not just of her advocacy work, but of a new phase in her life where she could be both a devoted wife and an independent woman with her own purpose and mission. "Thank you," she said to Eli as they settled into the rhythm of travel. "For what? For believing in me, for giving me the security and confidence I needed to find my voice, for loving me enough to let me grow into who I was meant to be." Eli reached over and squeezed her hand. "Thank you for showing me that love isn't something you lose and never find again, that sometimes the most unexpected gifts come wrapped in the most challenging circumstances." As they made their way home across the vast Arizona desert, Clara felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. She had faced her fears, found her purpose, and discovered that she was capable of far more than she'd ever imagined. But most importantly, she had found a love that saw her not as she was expected to be, but as she truly was: strong, capable, valuable, and worthy of respect. The ranch that came into view on the fourth day of their journey home looked exactly the same as when they'd left it. But Clara knew that they were returning as different people than they'd been when they departed. Their trip to Phoenix had tested their marriage, confirmed their love, and opened new possibilities for their future together. As Eli carried her up the ramp he'd built to their front porch, Clara looked out at the desert landscape that had become her sanctuary and felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her here, all of it, even the painful parts that had seemed like endings at the time. The spring of 1888 brought changes to the desert that seemed to mirror the transformation happening in Clara's own life. The harsh winter had given way to a season of unexpected abundance. Wildflowers bloomed in riot of color across the previously barren landscape. The creek that ran through their property swelled with snowmelt from the distant mountains, and even the cattle seemed to move with renewed energy through the greening pastures. Clara had thrown herself into her advocacy work with the same determination she'd once applied to learning how to navigate life from a wheelchair. Her correspondence with Margaret Thornton and other disability rights advocates had grown into a network that spanned the entire Arizona territory, and her small ranch had become an unofficial headquarters for organizing efforts throughout the region. The modifications Eli had made to their home now served a dual purpose. Not only did they make Clara's daily life easier, but they also demonstrated to visitors what accessibility could look like when implemented thoughtfully and with dignity. Delegates from various counties had made the journey to see their setup firsthand, and Clara had developed a reputation as someone who could offer practical solutions alongside moral arguments. "Mrs. Decker," said Thomas Henderson, a territorial legislator who had arrived that morning with 2 colleagues, "what you've accomplished here is remarkable. The ramps, the raised work surfaces, the way you've organized everything, it's proof that accommodation doesn't have to mean compromise." Clara smiled as she served coffee to their guests on the front porch, the same porch where she'd first sat as an abandoned and broken woman nearly a year ago. "The key is thinking about function rather than convention," she replied. "Most of the barriers people with disabilities face aren't natural. They're created by assumptions about how things should be done." The past few months had brought a steady stream of such visitors, people who came seeking Clara's insights on everything from architectural modifications to employment policies. Some were motivated by genuine concern for family members with disabilities, others by the growing recognition that disability rights were becoming a legitimate political issue that couldn't be ignored. But it was the more personal visits that touched Clara's heart most deeply. Just the week before, a young woman named Sarah Martinez had traveled from Tucson with her parents, seeking advice on how to adapt to life after a spinal injury from a riding accident remarkably similar to Clara's own. "I don't see how I can live like this," Sarah had whispered during their private conversation, tears streaming down her face. Everyone looks at me with such pity, and I feel so useless. Clara had taken the young woman's hands in her own, remembering all too clearly the despair that had once consumed her own heart. "I know exactly how you feel," she'd said softly. "But Sarah, you're not useless. You're just learning a new way to be useful." Over the course of several days, Clara had worked with Sarah and her family to identify adaptations and possibilities they hadn't considered. She'd shown Sarah how to transfer herself, how to modify clothing and living spaces for easier access, and most importantly, how to advocate for herself in a world that often seemed designed to exclude her. "The accident changed my body," Clara had explained on Sarah's final day, "but I had to choose whether to let it change my spirit. Every day I have to make that choice again, to see possibilities, instead of limitations, to focus on what I can control rather than what I can't." When Sarah left, she carried with her not just practical knowledge, but also something Clara recognized as precious hope. The transformation in the young woman's demeanor over those few days reminded Clara why her advocacy work mattered so much, why every letter she wrote and every speech she gave was worthwhile. As summer approached, Clara found herself dealing with a different kind of challenge. Her monthly cycles had become irregular, and she'd been experiencing a persistent fatigue that seemed unrelated to her usual activities. When the nausea began, she initially attributed it to something she'd eaten, or perhaps the stress of managing so many correspondents and visitors. It was Eli who first voiced the possibility they were both afraid to hope for. "Clara," he said one evening as she pushed away yet another barely touched dinner, "when was your last monthly bleeding?" Clara looked up at him with wide eyes, her mind racing as she tried to calculate dates that suddenly seemed impossibly blurred together. I'm not sure. Everything's been so busy lately, and with the irregular cycles since the accident." Eli moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her trembling hands in his steady ones. "Could you be pregnant?" The word hung in the air between them, loaded with yearning and terror in equal measure. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes as she contemplated the possibility that had seemed impossible for so long. "The doctors said, after the accident, they said my chances were very slim, that the damage to my spine might affect—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Doctors have been wrong before," Eli said gently, "and your body has surprised us all with what it's capable of." The next few weeks passed in a state of suspended animation as they waited for more definitive signs. Clara found herself torn between desperate hope and protective skepticism, afraid to fully believe in the possibility of motherhood that had seemed lost to her forever. When her condition became undeniable, when the nausea settled into a predictable pattern, when her body began to change in ways that couldn't be attributed to anything else Clara experienced, a joy so profound it left her breathless. "We're going to have a baby," she whispered to Eli one morning as they sat on their front porch watching the sunrise. "Against all odds, against all expectations, we're going to be parents." Eli's response was to pull her into his arms and hold her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she could feel the dampness of tears against her hair as he whispered his own amazement and gratitude into the morning air. The pregnancy, however, brought challenges neither of them had anticipated. Doc Harrison, the same physician who had treated Clara after her accident, was frank about the risks involved. "I won't lie to you, Mrs. Decker," he said during Clara's first examination. "Pregnancy in women with spinal cord injuries is not well understood. There could be complications we can't predict, problems with circulation difficulties during labor and delivery." But there was also hope in his assessment. "On the other hand," he continued, "you've shown remarkable adaptability to your condition. Your general health is excellent, and your injury seems to have affected primarily your lower extremities. There's no medical reason why you shouldn't be able to carry a child to term." As word of Clara's pregnancy spread through their community, it sparked reactions that revealed the full spectrum of attitudes toward disability and motherhood. Some people expressed genuine joy and excitement, seeing Clara's pregnancy as a wonderful development in a love story that had already captured local attention. Others were less supportive, questioning whether it was wise or even moral for a woman with Clara's limitations to attempt motherhood. These critics worried aloud about her ability to care for a child, about the risks to both mother and baby, about the kind of life a child could have with a disabled mother. It was Sheriff Mercer's response that cut deepest. Word of his daughter's pregnancy reached him through the gossip networks that connected small communities, and his reaction was swift and characteristic. He appeared at their ranch one sweltering July afternoon, his face grim with disapproval and something that might have been genuine concern. "Clara," he said without preamble as Eli helped her to the front porch to receive her unexpected visitor, "I need to speak with you about this situation." "What situation would that be, Father?" Clara asked coolly, though her heart was racing at his sudden appearance. "Don't play games with me. The whole territory is talking about your pregnancy. Do you have any idea what you're risking, what you're putting that child through?" Clara felt Eli's hand tighten protectively on her shoulder, but she raised her own hand to signal that she would handle this confrontation herself. "I'm risking the same things every woman risks when she chooses to become a mother," she replied steadily. "I'm giving a child the chance to be born into a loving family." "Loving family," Mercer scoffed. "Clara, you can barely take care of yourself. How do you expect to care for an infant? What happens when the child needs to be carried or chased after or protected from danger? What kind of life is that child going to have with a mother who can't even walk?" The cruel words were clearly designed to wound, and they found their mark. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, felt the old familiar shame and self-doubt rising in her chest. But then she looked at Eli, saw the fierce protectiveness in his gray eyes, and drew strength from the love that had transformed both their lives. "You're wrong, Father," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I can take care of a child, maybe not in the same ways other mothers do, but in ways that matter. I can love unconditionally, provide security and guidance, teach important lessons about resilience and strength. And I won't be doing it alone. I have a husband who loves both me and this child more than you ever loved your own daughter." Mercer's face darkened with anger at her defiance. "You're being selfish, Clara. You're risking that baby's life because you want something you have no right to want. Mark my words, this will end badly, and when it does, don't come crying to me for help." "I wouldn't dream of it," Clara replied with quiet dignity. "We stopped needing your help the day you abandoned me here, and look how well that turned out." After Mercer left in a cloud of dust and indignation, Clara found herself shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and emotion. Eli gathered her into his arms, holding her close as she wept tears that were part rage, part sorrow, and part relief. "He's wrong," Eli whispered into her hair, "about all of it. You're going to be an amazing mother, Clara. Our child is going to be so lucky to have you." "But what if he's right about the risks?" Clara asked through her tears. "What if I am being selfish? What if something goes wrong because of my limitations?" "Clara, look at me." Eli gently tilted her face up so she had to meet his eyes. "Every pregnancy carries risks. Every parent faces challenges and limitations of one kind or another. What matters is love, dedication, and the willingness to do whatever it takes to protect and nurture our child. You have all of those things in abundance." As Clara's pregnancy progressed through the summer and into early fall, she found herself drawing strength from unexpected sources. Letters of support poured in from disability rights advocates across the territory, many of them sharing their own experiences with pregnancy and parenting despite physical challenges. Margaret Thornton wrote with particular warmth, "My dear Clara, your pregnancy represents hope for so many women who have been told that disability means the end of their dreams of motherhood. You are proving that love and determination can overcome even the most daunting obstacles. But it was the support from their immediate community that meant the most to Clara. Their neighbors, the same people who had initially viewed her with curiosity and skepticism, rallied around the young couple with offers of help and practical assistance. Maria Santos, whose husband worked as a hand on a nearby ranch, appeared one morning with her arms full of baby clothes and blankets she'd sewn herself. "For the little one," she said shyly, her English still heavily accented but her meaning clear. "Every baby needs soft things." Doc Harrison made regular visits to monitor Clara's health, and his reports were consistently encouraging. The pregnancy was progressing normally, and Clara's body was adapting to the changes with remarkable resilience. "You're defying every textbook I've ever read," he told her during one examination. "By all conventional wisdom, this should be a high-risk pregnancy requiring constant bed rest. Instead, you're healthier and more active than half the pregnant women I treat." As autumn painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Clara threw herself into preparing for the baby's arrival with the same methodical determination she'd applied to learning advocacy. She and Eli modified the small room that had once been his daughter Annie's, creating a nursery that would be fully accessible to a mother who couldn't walk. They lowered the crib so Clara could reach in easily from her wheelchair, arranged changing supplies at a height she could manage, and even designed a special rocking chair with supports that would allow her to hold and comfort the baby safely. "It's going to work," Clara said one evening as they stood, she in her wheelchair, he beside her looking at the completed nursery. "We're going to make this work." "Of course we are," Eli replied, his hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly where their child grew. "We've made everything else work. This is just the next adventure." Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of bitter cold that made the desert feel like an alien landscape. Clara's pregnancy had reached the point where movement was becoming increasingly difficult, and she found herself spending more time indoors managing household affairs from the warmth of their kitchen while Eli handled the outdoor ranch work. It was during one of these cold December days, while Clara was writing letters to her advocacy contacts, that she felt the first unmistakable signs that labor was beginning. The sensation was unlike anything she'd experienced, a deep rolling tightness that seemed to encompass her entire torso, followed by a release that left her breathless. "Eli," she called, trying to keep her voice calm despite the flutter of panic in her chest. He appeared in the kitchen doorway within seconds, as if he'd been listening for any change in her voice. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know. "Is it time?" he asked, already moving toward her. "I think so." Clara gripped the edge of the table as another contraction rolled through her. "The pain started about an hour ago, but they're getting stronger." Eli was already reaching for his coat. "I'll ride for Doc Harrison." "No." Clara's voice was firm despite the pain. "Not yet. First babies take a long time, and it's too dangerous for you to ride in this weather unless it's absolutely necessary. We wait until we're sure." They spent the next several hours moving through the careful dance of early labor, with Eli timing contractions while Clara tried to remain calm and focused. She'd read everything she could find about childbirth, had corresponded with other women with disabilities who had successfully given birth, but nothing had quite prepared her for the reality of bringing a child into the world. By evening, it became clear that this was indeed the real thing, and Eli set out through the swirling snow to fetch Doc Harrison. Clara spent the long hours of his absence moving between her wheelchair and the bed, trying to find positions that would ease the increasing intensity of labor. When Eli returned with the doctor near midnight, Clara was deep in the grip of transition, the final phase of labor that would bring their child into the world. Doc Harrison examined her quickly and professionally, his expression shifting from concern to amazement. "Mrs. Decker," he said with something approaching awe, "I don't know how you're doing this, but you're doing it beautifully. Your body knows exactly what it's doing." The final hours of labor were a blur of pain and determination, of Eli's steady voice encouraging her through each contraction of Doc Harrison's calm professional guidance. Clara had feared that her disability would make childbirth more difficult or dangerous, but instead found that her years of adapting to physical challenges had taught her exactly the kind of mental focus and bodily awareness that labor required. As dawn broke over the snow-covered desert on December 18, 1888, Clara Elizabeth Decker gave birth to a healthy, perfect daughter. The moment the baby's cry filled the room, Clara felt a surge of emotion so profound it seemed to restructure her entire understanding of what love could be. "She's beautiful," Eli whispered, tears streaming down his face as Doc Harrison placed their daughter in Clara's arms. "She's absolutely perfect." Clara looked down at the tiny face of her daughter, their daughter, and felt the last pieces of her broken heart heal completely. This child represented the ultimate triumph over everyone who had told her she was worthless, everyone who had said her life was over, everyone who had insisted she had nothing valuable to offer the world. "Hello, little one," she whispered to the baby who was staring up at her with dark eyes that already seemed wise beyond their minutes. "I'm your mama, and you are the most wanted, most loved child in the entire world." They named her Sarah Grace Sarah for Eli's first wife and daughter Grace for the unexpected blessing she represented in both their lives. As the weeks passed and they settled into the rhythm of new parenthood, Clara discovered that her fears about her ability to care for a child had been largely unfounded. She developed techniques for diapering and bathing the baby that worked around her physical limitations, created feeding schedules that allowed her to manage nursing despite her wheelchair, and found ways to soothe and comfort Sarah that had nothing to do with the ability to walk. More importantly, she discovered that the qualities that made her a good advocate, patience, determination, the ability to see solutions where others saw only problems, also made her an excellent mother. "You're a natural," Eli observed one evening as he watched Clara rock baby Sarah to sleep in the specially designed chair they'd created. "It's like you were born to be her mother." "Maybe I was," Clara replied softly, looking down at the sleeping infant in her arms. "Maybe everything that happened to us, your losses, my accident, even my father's cruelty, maybe all of it was leading us to her." Spring returned to the desert, bringing with it a sense of renewal and possibility that seemed to encompass their entire world. Clara's advocacy work had necessarily taken a back seat during the final months of pregnancy and early weeks of motherhood, but inquiries and requests for her guidance continued to arrive from across the territory. Sarah proved to be a remarkably easy baby, as if she somehow understood that her parents had faced enough challenges already. She slept well, nursed eagerly, and seemed to thrive under the devoted attention of two people who had waited so long to experience the joy of parenthood. One warm April morning, as Clara sat on their front porch nursing Sarah, while watching Eli work with the cattle in the distance, she found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. 18 months ago, she had been her father's unwanted burden, a woman whose life seemed effectively over at age 20. Today, she was a wife, mother, and respected advocate whose voice was heard throughout the territory. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her reverie, and she looked up to see a familiar figure riding toward the ranch. Sheriff Mercer had returned, but this time he approached slowly, almost hesitantly, his usual arrogant posture replaced by something that might have been uncertainty. He dismounted near the porch and removed his hat, a gesture of respect Clara couldn't remember him ever showing her before. "Clara," he said quietly, I came to see my granddaughter." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken apologies and tentative hope for reconciliation. Clara looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw something she'd never noticed before, an aging man who had perhaps realized that his pride had cost him more than he'd ever intended to pay. "Her name is Sarah Grace," Clara said, finally adjusting the baby so her father could see her properly. "Sarah Grace Decker." Mercer stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the tiny face of his granddaughter. Clara saw his expression soften in a way she hadn't witnessed since she was a very young child, before her mother's death had hardened him into the bitter man who had abandoned her. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "She looks like you did as a baby, like your mother. Would you like to hold her?" Clara asked, surprising herself with the offer. Mercer's eyes filled with tears as he nodded, and Clara carefully transferred the baby into his arms. For several minutes, grandfather and granddaughter studied each other in silence, and Clara saw something she'd thought impossible, her father's face transformed by wonder and love. "I was wrong," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "About everything. About you, about what you could do, about what kind of life you could have. I let my own fear and disappointment make me cruel to the person I should have protected." Clara felt tears pricking at her own eyes at this unexpected admission. "Father..." "No, let me finish." Mercer looked up at her, and she saw genuine remorse in his pale eyes. "I told myself I was being realistic, that I was protecting you from disappointment by not letting you hope for too much. But the truth is, I was protecting myself. I couldn't bear to watch you struggle, couldn't face my own failure as a father, so I convinced myself you were beyond help." He looked down at Sarah again, and his voice grew softer. "But look at what you've accomplished. Look at the life you've built, the difference you've made. This beautiful child who exists because you refuse to accept my limitations on your dreams." Clara reached out and touched her father's arm, feeling the tension and grief of years beginning to ease. "Father, we all make mistakes. What matters is what we do moving forward." Mercer spent the rest of the morning at the ranch, holding his granddaughter, talking quietly with Clara about her advocacy work and showing a genuine interest in her life that she'd never experienced from him before. When Eli returned from his work, he found the 3 generations sitting peacefully on the front porch, and Clara saw the relief in her husband's eyes at this long overdue reconciliation. "Decker," Mercer said as he prepared to leave, "I owe you a debt I can never repay. You saw what I couldn't see, did what I should have done. You gave my daughter the life she deserved." "She gave me the life I deserved too," Eli replied simply. "We saved each other." As her father rode away, Clara felt a sense of completion she hadn't known she was seeking. The wounds of the past weren't magically healed, but they were finally beginning to scar over in a way that would allow genuine healing to begin. That evening, as she and Eli sat on their front porch, with Sarah sleeping peacefully between them, Clara found herself thinking about the unexpected gifts that had emerged from what had seemed like the darkest moments of her life. "Do you think we'll tell her the whole story someday?" Clara asked, gazing down at their daughter, "about how we met, about the circumstances that brought us together." "When she's old enough to understand it properly," Eli replied. "I want her to know that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from the most unlikely beginnings, that love can bloom even in the harshest soil." Clara smiled at the poetry in his words, recognizing the truth they contained. Their love story had indeed begun in the desert, not just the physical desert of Arizona, but the emotional desert they'd both inhabited after their respective tragedies had stripped away their hopes and dreams. "I want her to know she was wanted," Clara added. "Not just hoped for, but actively chosen, that we fought for the right to bring her into this world." "She'll know," Eli promised. "She'll know she's the most precious thing in our lives, and that her existence proves that miracles are possible." As the stars emerged in the vast Arizona sky and the desert settled into its evening quiet, Clara looked around at the life they had built together, the ranch that had become their sanctuary, the home that had sheltered their growing love, the family that represented the triumph of hope over despair. Sheriff Mercer's cruel joke had indeed backfired in the most spectacular way possible. What he had intended as the ultimate humiliation had become the catalyst for the greatest happiness any of them had ever known. His abandoned daughter had found not just a home, but a purpose, a voice, and a love that would echo through generations. Clara Mercer, no longer defined by her father's limitations or her accident's consequences, had become exactly who she was always meant to be, a woman whose strength had been tested by fire and proven unbreakable, whose voice carried the hopes of others who had been told they had nothing to offer, whose love had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone she touched. The desert wind whispered through the sage and mesquite, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and all the adventures it would bring for this remarkable family who had learned that sometimes the most broken things, when put back together with love, become the most beautiful of all. 10 years had passed since that snowy December night when Sarah Grace Decker entered the world, and the desert ranch that had once been a place of solitude and grief had transformed into something Clara could never have imagined, a beacon of hope that drew people from across the growing state of Arizona and beyond. The morning sun cast long shadows across the expanded property as Clara sat on the wraparound porch that Eli had built 3 years earlier, watching her daughter chase butterflies through the wildflower garden they'd planted together. At 10 years old, Sarah was a spirited child, with her father's steady gray eyes and her mother's fierce determination, completely unaware that there had ever been a time when people questioned whether her mother was capable of raising her. "Mama, look," Sarah called out, cupping something carefully in her small hands. "I caught the yellow one, but I'm going to let it go so it can find its family." Clara smiled at her daughter's compassion, a trait that seemed as natural to Sarah as breathing. "That's very wise, sweetheart. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is give others their freedom." As Sarah released the butterfly and watched it flutter away, Clara reflected on how much their lives had evolved since that first tentative kiss on this very porch 11 years ago. The modest ranch house had grown to accommodate not just their family, but the steady stream of visitors who came seeking Clara's guidance and inspiration. What had begun as informal consultations with individuals and families dealing with disability had evolved into something unprecedented. The Southwest Institute for Disability Advocacy, the first organization of its kind in the Arizona territory. Clara served as its director, coordinating with advocates across the country to push for legislation, accessibility improvements, and social change. The institute occupied a new building on their property, designed from the ground up with accessibility in mind. It housed Clara's offices, a library of resources related to disability rights, and meeting rooms where they hosted conferences that drew attendees from as far away as California and Texas. "Mrs. Decker," called a familiar voice from the direction of the main road. Clara turned to see Dr. Rebecca Martinez approaching on horseback, the same Sarah Martinez who had arrived as a broken young woman seeking hope 10 years earlier and had since become one of Clara's most trusted colleagues and dearest friends. After completing her education through correspondence courses that Clara had helped arrange, Rebecca had become the Institute's first staff physician, specializing in the medical aspects of spinal cord injuries. "Good morning, Rebecca," Clara called out warmly. "You're here early today. I wanted to review the presentation materials before our guests arrive," Rebecca replied, dismounting and tying her horse to the hitching post Eli had installed for visitors. "I still can't believe we're hosting representatives from 15 different states." The upcoming conference represented the culmination of years of advocacy work. For the first time, disability rights advocates from across the American West were gathering to coordinate their efforts and push for federal legislation that would provide protections and opportunities for people with disabilities nationwide. "Nervous?" Clara asked as Rebecca joined her on the porch. "Terrified," Rebecca admitted with a laugh, "but the good kind of terrified, the kind that means we're about to do something important." As they reviewed their plans for the conference, Clara found herself marveling at how much the conversation around disability had shifted over the past decade. What had once been viewed as a purely charitable concern was increasingly recognized as a civil rights issue, thanks in large part to the network of advocates that Clara and her colleagues had helped build. The sound of wagon wheels on the drive announced the arrival of more conference attendees, and Clara felt the familiar flutter of excitement that came with gathering her extended family of advocates together. These were people who understood the unique challenges of fighting for recognition and respect in a world that often preferred to overlook them entirely. Among the arrivals was Margaret Thornton, now in her 50s, but still as sharp and determined as ever. She had become something of a mentor to Clara over the years, and their correspondence had evolved into a deep friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "Clara, my dear," Margaret called out as she approached the porch. "Look at this place. Every time I visit, I'm amazed by what you've accomplished here." "We've accomplished," Clara corrected gently. "None of this would have been possible without the network we built together." As the day progressed and more attendees arrived, the ranch took on the atmosphere of a reunion. These were people who had been fighting lonely battles in their own communities, often facing skepticism and opposition from those who should have been supporting them. Here they found understanding, encouragement, and the strength that comes from knowing you're not alone. Eli moved through the gathering with quiet pride, ensuring their guests were comfortable and their needs met. Over the years, he had become Clara's most trusted partner in the advocacy work, using his growing influence in territorial politics to open doors that might have remained closed to others. "Papa," Sarah said, tugging on Eli's shirt as he passed near where she was playing with some of the younger children who had accompanied their parents to the conference. "Mrs. Henderson says her little boy Timothy uses sticks to help him walk, just like Mr. Peterson's crutches, but smaller. Is that because he's still growing?" Eli knelt down to Sarah's level, as he always did when she asked questions about the adult world she was gradually beginning to understand. "That's exactly right, sweetheart. Timothy has a condition that makes walking difficult for him, so he uses those sticks, we call them crutches, to help him get around, just like Mama uses her wheelchair to help her move from place to place. But that doesn't mean he can't do things right, like Mama does lots of important things even though she can't walk." "That's right," Eli confirmed, his heart swelling with pride at his daughter's natural understanding of what so many adults struggled to grasp. "What matters isn't how we move through the world, but what we choose to do while we're here." As evening approached, the formal conference sessions gave way to more intimate conversations around the dinner table and on the front porch. Clara found herself surrounded by people whose stories had become intertwined with her own. Over the years, advocates who had found their voices, families who had learned to see possibility instead of limitation, young people with disabilities who were pursuing dreams that previous generations had been told were impossible. "Clara," said James Mitchell, a blind attorney from California who had become one of the most effective legislative advocates in the Western states. "I wanted to thank you again for the letter of introduction you provided when I was seeking admission to the state bar. I don't think I would have had the courage to push through the initial rejections without knowing you believed in what I was trying to accomplish." "You would have found the courage," Clara replied with certainty. "I just helped you find it a little sooner." "That's what you do, isn't it?" observed Dr. Patricia Williamson, a physician from Colorado who had been born without her left arm and had fought for years to be accepted into medical school. "You help people see that their limitations don't have to define their possibilities." Clara considered the observation thoughtfully. "I think we help each other see that. None of us can do this work in isolation. It's only when we come together, when we share our experiences and support each other's dreams, that we become powerful enough to change minds and hearts." As the evening wore on and the desert stars emerged in their full glory, the conversation turned to the future, what they hoped to accomplish in the coming years, what battles still needed to be fought, what victories they dared to imagine. I dream of a world where children like Timothy and Sarah grow up never questioning whether they belong," said Rebecca Martinez, gesturing toward where the children were playing together in perfect harmony, their various physical differences unremarked and unremarkable among them. A world where accessibility isn't an accommodation, but an expectation, where diversity of ability is seen as a strength rather than a burden. "It's possible," Clara said quietly, her voice carrying the conviction born of years of incremental victories and gradual progress. "Maybe not in our lifetimes, but in theirs. Every barrier we remove, every mind we change, every door we open, makes it easier for the next person to walk through." Later that night, after their guests had retired to their rooms in the expanded house and the various outbuildings Eli had constructed to accommodate visitors, Clara and Eli sat alone on their porch, as they had so many times over the years. Sarah was asleep upstairs in her room, surrounded by the books and toys of a childhood that had been filled with love and limitless possibility. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if your father had made a different choice that day?" Eli asked, echoing a conversation they'd had years earlier, but with the wisdom of hindsight now to inform their reflections. Clara considered the question as she had many times over the years. "I used to wonder about that, but now I think everything happened exactly as it needed to, not because there was some grand plan, but because we chose to make the best of what we were given." She reached over and took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of years of hard work and dedication. "Your father's cruelty was real, and it caused real pain, but it also forced us both to discover strengths we might never have found otherwise. It brought us together when we needed each other most." "And now," Eli asked, "now we have something neither of us could have imagined when we were at our lowest points. We have love, we have purpose, we have a family, and we have the ability to help others find their own strength. That's not just healing from our wounds, that's transforming them into something beautiful." The next morning brought the formal opening of the conference, with delegates gathering in the meeting hall Clara and Eli had built specifically for such occasions. As Clara looked out at the sea of faces, people who had traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles to be part of this gathering, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment and responsibility. 10 years ago, she began her opening remarks, most of us felt alone in our struggles. We faced barriers not just in our physical environments, but in people's expectations and assumptions about what we could accomplish. Today, we stand together as proof that those assumptions were wrong. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room, making eye contact with as many attendees as possible. We are teachers and doctors, lawyers and business owners, parents and advocates. We are people who refuse to accept limitations others tried to place on our dreams. And we are here to ensure that the next generation doesn't have to fight as hard as we did for the right to participate fully in society. The applause that greeted her words was thunderous, filled with the energy of people who had found their tribe and their purpose. Over the next 3 days, the conference would produce concrete plans for legislative action strategies, for building broader public support, and a network of cooperation that would span the continent. But perhaps most importantly, it would send dozens of advocates back to their home communities with renewed energy and the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves. On the final evening of the conference, as the delegates prepared to depart the next morning, Clara found herself in conversation with a young man named David Chen, whose family had immigrated from China and who had been born with a condition that left him unable to use his legs. "Mrs. Decker," David said, his voice filled with the earnestness of youth, "I want to study law to become an advocate like you, but my parents are afraid. They say people will never accept a Chinese man with a disability as a lawyer, that I'm asking for too much discrimination." Clara studied the young man's face, seeing in his expression the same hunger for purpose and recognition that she had felt years earlier. "David, can I tell you something my husband once told me?" David nodded eagerly. He said that our worth isn't determined by what we can or can't do with our bodies, but by who we are as people. Your parents love you and want to protect you from disappointment. But protection from failure also means protection from success. She leaned forward, making sure he could see the conviction in her eyes. Yes, you'll face discrimination. Yes, people will underestimate you and try to convince you that your dreams are unrealistic. But you'll also find allies and mentors and opportunities you can't imagine. And every barrier you break down makes it easier for the next person who follows your path. How do I convince my parents? Show them what's possible. Start small, take correspondence courses, volunteer with legal aid organizations, build your knowledge and your network. Let your actions speak louder than their fears. As David walked away, his shoulders straighter and his step more confident, Clara felt the familiar satisfaction that came from planting seeds of possibility in fertile ground. The following morning, as their guests departed with promises to stay in touch and commitments to continue the work in their home communities, Clara and Eli stood on their front porch watching the last wagon disappear over the hill that led away from their ranch. Another successful conference. Eli observed his arm around Clara's shoulders. The beginning of something even bigger, I think, Clara replied. Can you feel it? The momentum building, the way attitudes are shifting. Sarah appeared beside them, having helped with the breakfast preparations and farewells despite her young age. Mama, when I grow up, will I have conferences too? Clara looked down at her daughter, this child who had grown up surrounded by advocates and dreamers, who had never known a world where disability was automatically equated with limitation. That depends, sweetheart. What do you want to advocate for? Sarah considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. I think I want to help children who feel different or scared or like they don't belong anywhere. I want them to know they're special and important. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes at her daughter's natural compassion and sense of justice. Then yes, I think you'll have many conferences, and I suspect you'll change the world in ways even better than we have. As they made their way inside to begin cleaning up after their guests, Clara reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this point. The broken woman who had been abandoned on this porch 11 years earlier had become someone she could never have imagined, a leader, an advocate, a voice for the voiceless. But more than that, she had become exactly who she was always meant to be, once the world's expectations and limitations had been stripped away, and she'd been free to discover her own strength and purpose. That afternoon, as Clara worked in her office reviewing correspondence and planning for upcoming legislative sessions, she came across a letter that made her pause. It was from Thomas Whitmore, the same Thomas who had abandoned her after her accident, who had disappeared rather than face the reality of loving someone with a disability. The letter, postmarked from San Francisco, was formal but respectful. Dear Mrs. Decker, I hope this letter finds you well. I have been following news of your advocacy work through various publications, and I wanted to express my admiration for what you have accomplished. I also wanted to offer my apologies for my behavior following your accident. I was young and frightened, and I handled the situation in a way that caused you additional pain during an already difficult time. I hope you have found happiness and fulfillment in your life. Your work is making a difference for countless people, and I am grateful to know that some good has come from circumstances that began in tragedy. With sincere respect, Thomas Whitmore. Clara read the letter twice, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. There was validation in Thomas's acknowledgement of his failures, but also a sense of distance from the woman she had been when his opinion mattered to her. She showed the letter to Eli that evening, curious about his reaction. How do you feel about it? He asked, after reading it carefully. Grateful, I suppose, not because I needed his apology, but because it confirms how far we've all come. The woman he abandoned was broken and dependent and afraid. The woman he's writing to now is someone he clearly respects, even if he doesn't fully understand how she came to be. Are you going to respond? Clara considered the question. I think I will. Not because I owe him anything, but because forgiveness isn't just for the person who receives it. It's for the person who gives it. It's the final step in putting the past where it belongs. She wrote her response that night, a brief but gracious note that acknowledged his apology and updated him on her life, her marriage, her daughter, her work. She ended with words that surprised her with their sincerity. I hope you too have found happiness and purpose in your life. We all deserve the chance to grow beyond our younger selves' limitations. As spring turned to summer, and the desert bloomed with unexpected abundance after an unusually wet winter, Clara found herself thinking more and more about legacy, not just the concrete changes her advocacy work had achieved, but the intangible impact of a life lived with purpose and determination. She was working in this garden one morning, Sarah helping her transplant seedlings into the raised beds Eli had built to accommodate her wheelchair, when her daughter asked a question that went straight to the heart of Clara's reflections. Mama, do you think Grandpa Sheriff is proud of you now? Clara paused in her planting, considering how to answer. Her relationship with her father had evolved over the years, since Sarah's birth, into something that wasn't quite reconciliation, but was much warmer than the bitter estrangement of earlier years. He visited regularly, clearly devoted to his granddaughter, and had even made grudging admissions that Clara's advocacy work was important and necessary. I think he's learning to be proud, Clara said finally. Sometimes it takes people a long time to understand that being different doesn't mean being less valuable. Your grandfather is a good man who made some bad choices because he was afraid and didn't know how to handle his fear. Like Mr. Thomas in the letter, Clara smiled at her daughter's perceptiveness. Yes, like Mr. Thomas. People aren't born knowing how to love someone with a disability, sweetheart. They have to learn, just like we have to learn how to live with our differences. The important thing is that most people are willing to learn if we're patient and help them understand. And if they're not willing to learn, then we love ourselves anyway, and we find people who do understand, like Papa and Aunt Rebecca and all our friends who come to the conferences. That evening, as Clara tucked Sarah into bed, her daughter asked another question that revealed her growing understanding of the adult world around her. Mama, when you were little like me, did you dream about being famous and important like you are now? Clara laughed softly at the characterization. I don't think I'm famous, sweetheart. And I'm not important because people know my name. I'm important because I try to help people who need help. But did you dream about it? Clara thought back to her own childhood, remembering a girl who had dreamed of marriage and children and a conventional life that would meet everyone's expectations. No, I dreamed about very different things. I wanted to be like other girls, to fit in and never cause any trouble. But this is better, isn't it? Much better, Clara agreed, because this is real. This is who I really am, not who I thought I was supposed to be. As Sarah drifted off to sleep, Clara remained beside her bed for a few extra minutes, watching her daughter's peaceful face and marveling at the chain of events that had led to this moment. Every heartbreak, every triumph, every moment of despair and hope had been a necessary step on the path to this life they had built together. Later, as she and Eli sat on their front porch watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky, Clara shared her daughter's questions and her own reflections on legacy and meaning. Do you think she understands how unusual her childhood is? Eli asked. Growing up surrounded by advocates and activists, thinking it's normal for disabled people to be leaders and change makers. I hope she never fully understands how unusual it is, Clara replied. I hope her generation takes it for granted that people with disabilities can do anything they set their minds to. That would mean we succeeded. We have succeeded, Eli said firmly. Maybe not in changing the whole world, but in changing our part of it, in giving people hope and tools and the knowledge that they're not alone. Clara nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle in her heart. They had succeeded in ways both large and small, both public and intensely personal. The broken woman who had been abandoned on this porch had not just survived, she had thrived, had loved, had created a family and a legacy that would outlast her own life. As they made their way inside, Clara paused at the threshold to look back at the desert landscape that had become her sanctuary and her kingdom. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to advocate and educate and inspire. There would be setbacks and victories, moments of frustration and breakthrough. But tonight she was simply Clara Decker, wife, mother, advocate, and living proof that the most beautiful lives are often built from the most broken beginnings. The sheriff's cruel joke had indeed backfired spectacularly, creating not the humiliation he had intended, but a love story that would inspire generations of people who had been told their dreams were impossible. In the end, perhaps that was the greatest victory of all, not just surviving the cruelty of those who couldn't see her worth, but transforming that cruelty into something so beautiful, it illuminated the path forward for countless others who needed to know that their stories too could have happy endings. The desert wind whispered through the sage and mesquite, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and the enduring legacy of love that had transformed two broken hearts into an unbreakable force for change and hope.